thank you, John and Ruth and all of the folks at Eagleton. This is a terrific exercise, and they are extraordinarily patient with a guy who sometimes schedule is less than organized. And to all of you that are here, let me say thank you for your participation. And most of all, I think I said this at the first, there's nothing in my administration that I have a right to take credit for other than the mistakes and failures, because the people around this table and others of your colleagues did a remarkable job. And I am extraordinarily grateful for those efforts in those 4 years. Some of you with me a little longer in the Senate. Some of the things that we worked on actually moved seamlessly from one venue to another. And maybe the most important thing I'd like to say about today is the things we are talking about today are the reason I got into politics, the reason to be a former senator and a former governor. I had always carried a sense of responsibility, sort of, if I were in the political stump, I'd say, to those who much is given, much is expected, and that there need be attention to those who are left behind or left not quite able to accomplish everything they should because of the way our societies work. And I think the team that I had worked with, both here, those of you here today and otherwise, recognize the kind of debate we're having in a society today about inequality and steps, practical things that needed to be done to make that happen. And Ann and I were reminiscing just for a second. When we first went to the United States Senate, we had to deal with racial profiling and speak out about it. And we developed legislation to deal with it. And we were really at the cutting edge. And then we got another opportunity to actually work on those issues. And I look at Kevin and moving from foster care to adoption, and now seeing what Kevin's doing at Covenant House, and all of the things that so many of you are doing make me so proud that the themes that we began with carrying on further into other people's lives and other activities. So the only problem I have today, particularly as I look to the group on criminal justice, is there's one person missing. I guess he can't be here, is Stuart Rabner, who created an enormous catalyst to pull great minds and people together and work together, and is doing that as we go forward. But I hope all of you know how proud I am of each of you, whether you're on the panel or you're not, for what you did in our administration, for the work that you've done. And my biggest regret is not, and I really mean this, is not winning re-election, because I think the things that we were working on take more time than 4 years, in all fairness. Changing laws, changing structures and institutions is a challenging task in a short period of time, and we did a lot. Look at Julie and think about paid family leave. I'm not going to go off on things that you will all talk about, but we were way, way ahead. And some of you probably saw a little attempt at getting back in the public eye. I wrote an editorial on the death penalty that was published this weekend. You know, we were working on this stuff from the moment, and it's sort of the point of the spear with regard to the criminal justice work that everybody did remarkable things on. So I'm going to stop there. A, thank you. B, I'm proud of what you did and what almost all of you are doing with your lives as you carry forward with an agenda that is helping others. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's turn it over to Ann.
Great. First of all, thank you to Eagleton. I have not sat in this room since my senior year in college when I was affiliated with the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And I loved it, and so it's great to be back. And I'd forgotten how magical this space is. And second of all, it feels like kind of like a wedding or a family reunion. I have to be a little careful with what I say since this will be videotaped for posterity. We'll make the jokes later. But it's fantastic to see everybody, and it feels like yesterday. The two things I would say before we sort of jump in, and I'll do a quick introduction of everyone to my left before we start, is first of all, Governor, I can't tell you, I mean, I think we all recognize what a tremendous job you did as governor for those 4 years, but I will tell you that over the past week as I've gone back and I've looked at everything, I cannot believe how much you got done. I really cannot believe it. And I was struck by you, with your leadership, everyone in this room, but none of that would have happened without your vision and your leadership. And really, when we talk about criminal justice, so many of the things we talk about, and I do so much work nationally today, New Jersey was thinking about and doing 13 years ago, and that's an extraordinary thing, and you deserve so much credit for that. I'll say one other thing, which I think Stuart Rabner can't be here because he's the Chief Justice, and they have this silly rule in New Jersey. I think we can criticize this. They have a silly rule that the judges can't come, and I think it's a shame because there are so many great members of your administration who are now on the bench and who would offer a lot of insight. But I would just make one note about Chief Justice Rabner, who you nominated to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's been renominated. Now he's got life tenure. And he just published a report on bail reform in the state of New Jersey that is extraordinary. No state, and I should say, Ricardo is my lawyer for my part in bail reform. Thank you, Ricardo. The case is still pending, so we won't talk too much about that part of it. But what Stuart and the legislature and the governor did, and they all deserve credit, is completely transformational. They have essentially eliminated bail in the state. Their jail population is down by 44%. There have been virtually no increases in people failing to appear or crime. So the state is safer. There is deeply less racial discrimination within our system. And it's really an unbelievable, important rebalancing of the system that, candidly should have happened across the country years ago. But I'm so honored and proud of the Chief Justice for the work he's done. And that is also, I think, a tribute to you. So I'm not going to say any more nice things about you now, lest I embarrass you too much. I want to say one thing about David Wald, who this day would not be complete without him, because he has all the institutional knowledge of law and public safety. And when I cannot remember what we did, and that happens sometimes, I don't know if I've washed it out or if I've intentionally forgotten things, but I call David, or I call Ricardo, or I call John Vasquez, and the person who usually wins with the right answer, no offense, is David. So feel free to interrupt me at any point if I say the wrong thing, because it's totally possible. So we have a great group here, all of whom I worked really close with and feel so fortunate to have here today. Chen, who is now back at Rutgers Law School, but Ron was the public advocate for much of the time that I was in the state of New Jersey. Lisa Macaluso was the head of policy for the Juvenile Justice Commission, which was within the AG's office, and she spearheaded, and we'll talk about this, the Juvenile Detentions Alternatives Initiative, which was transformational for juvenile justice in the state. Ricardo Solano, my lawyer and my good friend, was also the first assistant attorney general, and Ricardo oversaw a lot of our law enforcement work. And then, of course, Ken Zimmerman, who had done many things as a lawyer before he joined the state and many things as a philanthropy executive since, but at the time he was in the state, he was the governor's counsel and led many of the things we're going to talk about today. Hi, Tom Shea. Hi. Sorry. Nice to see you.
Hi, everybody.
Just like old times. if you pull out the brick breaker. Okay, so I wanted to start by asking everyone, and I'll start with Ken and then work my way to Ron. I always think one of the best things you can ask people when you go back in time is to tell the story of an incident or an event that best captures something for them. And so here it's what what can you tell us that most captures in your mind criminal justice under the Corzine administration?
Well, thanks, Ann. Governor, it's great to see you. Eagleton, thanks. But unquestionably, as you started, it is actually the memory of the signing of the legislation about the abolition of the death penalty. And just to put it into context, that was the first legislative abolition of the death penalty since 1973. And it only happened because the governor was insistent upon it. And there were two particular dynamics that stick with me. One was the actual legislative signing ceremony. As everybody's aware, normally that's something that attracts every legislator possible to take credit for it. Neither the Senate Majority Leader nor the Leader of the Assembly showed up for that legislative signing. And it's a reflection that it only took place because of the governor's deep commitment and an understanding of the legislator and a number of others about the fact that this was important to him. I mean, I think there was very good work done with the Death Penalty Moratorium Commission, Reverend Howard. But the other piece of this that is the personal memory is that I was sitting on my office on the Friday before the Monday signing, and I got a call, and my assistant came in and said, "It's somebody from the Vatican, and they want to talk to you." And I couldn't quite figure out why the Jewish lawyer in the governor's office is getting a call from the Vatican. But it turned out that they were calling because they wanted to see if we had any objection to the lighting of the Roman Colosseum on Monday at the same time that the bill was being signed. It's apparently something they regularly do when the sanctity of life is being recognized. We couldn't figure out any legal dynamic that would prevent us from weighing in, but I think it's a reflection that the significance of the legislative abolition of the death penalty was not something only important in New Jersey or only important in the US, but in international ramifications, and that obviously is something that I was incredibly privileged to be part of.
That's wonderful. I'm going to come back and ask you more questions about it, but let's carry on now for what sticks in your mind the most.
So for me, it's also another piece of legislation. It was the legislation that was signed toward the end of the Governor Corzine's term, ending the consent decree that had been entered into between the state and the Department of Justice with the state police and the racial profiling issue. And I think the reason it was so important was because they were sort of at a crossroads where it was time to get out from under the oversight of the Department of Justice, but there was also a need to ensure that the progress that had been made wouldn't slide back. And I think it's indicative of so many of Governor Corzine's law enforcement policies that are carried forward by the Attorney General Rabner and then Ann, which was a balance between making sure that you partnered with law enforcement to accomplish the necessary law enforcement goals, but also do it in a way that was responsible to society and to the community. And that racial profile legislation, which took a lot of hard work because there were so many parties interested in it, I think managed to balance those two. It returned the state police back to their own governance and recognize all the reforms they had made internally and with the AG's office, but it also put in a mechanism in the AG's office to make sure that oversight was there and that we wouldn't fall back to the risk of the racial profile that had gone on.
That's great. Lisa?
So thank you, Governor Corzine, and thank you, Ann, and thank you, Eagleton. I think the moment that stands out the most for me is in 2008, New Jersey became the first model site for the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative to go to scale. And so there's a lot of things that went into that, but the meaningful part to me was that they held a press conference, and in the press conference, Ann was there at the press conference, and Chief Justice Rabner was there at the press conference, and it really sent a message to the country that in New Jersey, the people at the top care about kids. The people at the top understand what unnecessary and inappropriate use of secure detention is, and the people at the top were pushing that agenda just as much as folks at the local level in the counties and folks in the agencies. And so that legacy actually left us to become a model site and host states from all over the country. So to date, New Jersey has hosted 15 different states who are seeking to replicate the work that we did here.
And Lisa, can you just describe a little bit of JDAI, the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative? Kevin, I think, once called it a miracle of government, and I would agree with that. But maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what it is.
Sure. So about 25 years ago, the Annie E. Casey Foundation started a reform movement, a set of strategies to eliminate the unnecessary and inappropriate use of secure detention. And at that time, you may remember that John DiIulio was getting everybody primed for a super predator wave where kids were all going to need to be locked up, and folks were investing tons of money in building detention facilities. Detention facilities were also very overcrowded, very dangerous, both for the staff and for the kids that were in them. And so for the first 10 years of that work, the Casey Foundation only worked at the local level, implementing these core strategies. And New Jersey was fortunate to be selected to try to bring the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative to scale, meaning that we wouldn't just do it in a county or two, but we would make this the way that the state has done its business. And so the model, the delegation of a model site designation rather is really to show people this is not an anomaly, that this is something that's replicable and that other states can follow. And so is that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
That's great. Ron?
Well, Ken and Ricardo and Lisa have spoken about events that are sort of culminations that resulted in a very demonstrable achievement. When I reflect back on what I think, how I remember the Corzine administration, I think back sort of on the beginning of a planting of a seed. And it's an issue that at the time I worked a lot with Ann and Ricardo on, which is how law enforcement dealt with our immigrant population, and particularly the specific debate was how the state should implement Section 287G. To what extent should state law enforcement be involved in enforcing our federal immigration laws against immigrants who could not establish lawful presence. And when I say that at the time it didn't seem like an achievement, well, it was an achievement, and issued a directive. And Ricardo and Ann and I and others in my department and in theirs had a big debate about the appropriateness of state law enforcement getting involved when a lot of us thought, and including Ann, that by, in large measure state law enforcement, this really should not be their business to develop a relationship of trust. On the other hand, I quite recognize there were all sorts of pressures. We had some local municipal officials who had, in my very misguided views of what the role should be. And also, the reality is that law enforcement is intended to protect people. So Ann issued a directive whose language you probably have nightmares to this day. We put over word, and we discuss at length what reasonable belief might be. And I'll admit right now, I did not completely agree with the language at the time, but it was the beginning of a process. It's how we were setting the stage for a very, very difficult policy argument. And when I say that it was the planting of the seed, we know now, 10 years later, that there has been, that seed has given fruit, blossom, whatever metaphor you want to use. The current Attorney General, Gabriel Graywall, in November issued an immigrant trust directive, which I won't say superseded Ann's directive, but it sort of graduated it to the next level, in which basically state law enforcement now is sort of out of the business, except in very, very defined circumstances of enforcing federal law. And I remember sending Ann an email when I saw that she issued a statement completely supportive of Attorney Graywall's new directive. So it was, it's the type of thing where an achievement, it couldn't happen in 4 years, but it didn't happen in 10. And I see a lot of that, of the work that I was working on, things that we started that might not have been brought to fruition by January, whatever it was, 2010, but is coming to fruition now.
Thank you, Ron. I would add my own, which is...
I
please.
did want to say that I thought Ron was going to mention that when we first set up his new office, that he didn't have a secretary. He didn't have a computer, and it took at least 6 months to get...
I said my piece on it the first session. No double jeopardy.
And there's still time. There's still time. So I would add my greatest recollection really relates to the city of Camden, and there are a few things with Camden. But when I became AG on day one, a prior Attorney General, Peter Harvey, had superseded the Camden, New Jersey Police Department. And he had taken it over because Camden was the most dangerous city in America, and it had been the most dangerous city in America consistently for many years. And we spent a lot of time in the governor's office talking about not just public safety in Camden, but also, and you may have done this in the last convening, a lot about just governance in Camden and what it would look like for the state to supersede the entire city. And it was an extraordinary experience, and I would sort of say without question the hardest work I've ever done was the work that we did in Camden. We started, and I'll tell you a story I remember with you and I, which was we both went down separately for the swearing in of the county prosecutor, Warren, whose last name I cannot remember. David? Falk, yeah, thank you, Ricardo. Warren Falk, who is the county prosecutor. I have like half of everything in my head. It's like a giant Mad Libs. So if everyone just helps me, we'll get through it. So Warren Falk was being sworn in, and the swearing in wasn't until like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Do you remember this? Okay, so this is how these. It's a race to the bottom. So I went down in the morning and I drove around with then Police Captain Scott Thompson, who's now the chief of police, and we drove throughout the entire city, and we heard sirens, but we never saw a single police car in the most dangerous city in America. And of course, we ran the department. And I walked in later that afternoon, and we also saw a hand-to-hand buy and bust, which I'll never forget, of a kid who should have been in school, literally sell drugs right in front of an unmarked police car. And everyone in America generally knows what an unmarked police car looks like. Everyone at that time in Camden definitely knew. And it was just a sign of just how bad things were. And I walked into the county prosecutor's office, and I was still like thinking all these things in my head. And the first thing you said to me is, I've been here for 2 hours, I haven't seen a goddamn police car. Sorry, I shouldn't curse for the video. And actually, you might have said worse. Do you remember this? And yes. And it was all I could think as well. And we spent time that day talking about what are we going to do and how are we going to remake the police department. And we struggled, and John Vasquez was a part of it. Ricardo was a great part of it. Ken was a part of it. But over those 4 years, we reduced violent crime in Camden by 41%, homicides by 46%, and probably most importantly, I think we showed that the city can be safe. And today it is the safest it's been in decades. And so to me, I could tell a lot of other stories about Camden, and maybe we'll get to some of them because they're incredibly colorful, but that to me stands in my mind as really understanding what public safety and caring for a community meant, and that's a great example of one of the transformations. And by the way, so much of that was only possible because of the governor's support in so many different ways. Hiring police officers, suspending state civil service, getting new police cars, completely redeploying how the police department worked.
I'd like to just add one element there, because it's important to understand how leadership does have to work by your actions. We also took down that prison.
Right. That's right.
Which was not
it was on the waterfront.
Used, but was just a complete aggravation to the people who lived in the community, served no earthly purpose for any real reason. And this team gave me the basis to be able to get something done that sent a signal that we weren't trying to dump all of the problems of the state into a place that was already troubled. But I just, as an add-on, and I do remember that drive.
You can jump in anytime.
Governor Corzine, if you could just move your mic over a little bit, I think they'll pick up this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I'm going to come back to you, Ricardo, on the state police consent decree, because I think one of the things that's worth just noting is that when the governor made this push to sort of make it, to institutionalize the consent decree, nobody wanted to do that. And so can you talk us through DOJ's position on it, the state police's position? I mean, it's an important part of the conversation. Like Ron is right, yeah, exactly. Ron is right that we're sort of talking about the conclusions, which are important, but I think some of the process here is worth noting.
So as you mentioned, the state police absolutely felt like, and it was understandable, that they had been under a microscope for 10 years, that they had made all this progress in terms of monitoring their conduct, reviewing stops, making sure that race wasn't playing a factor in how traffic stops were occurring on the turnpike or elsewhere. And so they were very animate, and their union was, and minced no words with the fact that they thought enough was enough and that they had an opportunity to get out of the consent decree completely. And there was some merit to that, and certainly, like I said, understandable. I remember my assignment from the general was, like in other areas, was get it done. Was just get it done and let's fix this, because it made perfect sense from a policy perspective that while that was an option, that there's too much of a risk that it could slide back, and that why take that chance. And so we had within the Attorney General's office, which is still there, an Office of Professional Law Enforcement, I forget the acronym, I can't even, but it was Law Enforcement Professionalism, I think it's what it was. And we're already doing a lot of the work, and the individuals there, so we felt confident that they could continue to do it and that it made sense. And so we were able to work with both the legislators. I remember at the time Assemblyman Johnson had a lot of interest in this, and we had to deal with those interests, and
Senator
the black
Rice
minister,
had a lot of
Senator
concerns,
Rice, a lot of the areas that were impacted and who represented constituents who were impacted by this, and we're very fearful because it wasn't just a couple of years, it was a long history of this racial profiling. And I was proud of the fact that I was able to play a small part in getting that done by sort of bringing together all these interests, and we were able at the end of the day to put together, really draft conditions on getting out of the consent decree and sort of use that to our leverage to say, if you want to get out of it, which they really did, you're going to have to accept this. And ultimately, we brought the state police around. They were complete buy-in by them. The unions reluctantly were dragged in, the union representatives, but they came along. And ultimately, the governor was able to sign a piece of legislation that is obviously still in effect today, and that I think that office continues. And it was important because for all the work that the administration had done, it was important to get it done then, because it would have gotten done at some point, and it might have gotten done without the protections that were able to be built in.
Yeah, I'll never forget the call I got from the head of the special litigation section of the Department of Justice, who oversaw the consent decree, saying, we don't want this, we just want it done. Because at that point, the state police had done an extraordinary job of compliance. And I remember having the conversation, which was basically, you know, we're all sensitive to that, but the governor wants to make sure it doesn't happen again. And how do we sort of institutionalize it in the state? And so that, I think, it was a significant accomplishment on your part to navigate what was a tricky, and the governor's part to navigate what was a complex issue.
And can you refresh my memory? Because I think we were an early mover with regard to using cameras in cars, right?
Yes.
And wasn't that
Yes.
was part of this whole consent decree process?
Yes. So when New Jersey, when the special litigation section at the Department of Justice entered into a consent decree with the state police, they essentially required a pretty sophisticated computer statistics program, and the monitors also decided to put cameras in the police cars, and they were one of the first states to do it statewide. Every state police car had cameras, and then what they would do is pull every stop, and they had the first line supervisors regularly auditing them and checking, and if they found problems, they moved to correct them quickly. And it was really those two things that were the transformative pieces. And I'll tell you a funny aside, which is, Ricardo may remember this, at the beginning, all the cameras mysteriously broke every time the troopers were going out. And then finally someone had to say, well, if you go out with a broken camera or the camera's broken while you're out, you get docked a days of pay. Yeah. And then miraculously, they were the best cameras that had ever been purchased in the United States of America. But it really was transformational. And I would say this, there's not a single state trooper who would go out without a camera today. They know it protects them more than anything. And so it's just the initial, I think that's also true of body cams now, but it's the initial sort of hurdle.
Yeah, I think if I could just add, I think the law enforcement, the state police definitely came to appreciate them. And I know from talking to law enforcement, they like the cameras either on their body or in the car, because as often as it implicates somebody for doing something inappropriate, it exonerates them for not having done something that they're being complained or charged with.
I'm going to come back to you, Lisa, on juvenile detention for a minute, because I think we talked a little bit about JDAI. Can you talk a little bit about the drop in the state population that we saw during the time you were in New Jersey?
Sure. So when we first, thank you. When we first started this work in 2004, slightly before the Corzine administration, the average daily population of kids in secure detention was over 900 kids. around 925. So what that means is on any given day in New Jersey, there were 925 kids just about in secure detention centers, county-run detention centers around the country. And when we looked at this, the reason to do this, right, to try to get folks to want to do this work, what we found was that arrests had been declining for 10 years. Index crime arrests had been declining for 10 years, which are the more serious kinds of juvenile arrests. But at the same time, detention admissions were going up, average daily population was going up, and what we were trying to do was build ourselves out of it. So the number of detention beds in the state increased about 58% during that time frame. And of course, when we looked at the data, the kids who were being affected were kids of color and girls. Those are the kids who were in there every single day, those 925 kids. And so there's, just to fast forward to sort of the end, right? So the impact work of this. Today, there are 230 kids in secure detention on any given day. 230. Wow. Now, I will say that this still impacts primarily kids of color, not so much girls. The girls are not necessarily being detained at the same level that they used to be, but we have a big problem still in dealing with race equity and minority overrepresentation, and that's work that continues now.
Yeah, I remember the first time I think you briefed me on the disproportionate minority incarceration. I don't remember if it was 97% minority. I don't, maybe you recall the percentage minority, but I just remember thinking it can't be right.
It's still 90.4.
90.4% minority.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I agree that there's a lot of work left to be done. The work that you did, Ken, with the Department of Corrections, I know it's a little bit, it's not directly criminal justice, but I think it's really important to talk about, because I think about, and we'll come back on some of the law enforcement side in a minute, but if I think about those 4 years, I think we saw incredible drops in crime, which beat national averages. We also saw incredible drops in population, both in juvenile justice and in the Department of Corrections. So if you could talk us through the work there.
Sure. And it's interesting just to build on it, because these are complicated systems. It was actually in preparation for this, I realized I was actually the co-chair of the transition team on corrections, which I had slipped my mind for some reason. But the significance was, corrections, as in many places, is a troubled agency. It doesn't get the attention. It only gets the attention when bad things happen. And as a result, when budgets are limited, what gets cut out is everything that is devoted to assisting those who are being released, and 99% of everybody is being released. And as a result, recidivism starts being driven up. And so I think there was an early recognition from the governor, from the now Chief Justice and others, that this was an opportunity to both reduce crime by addressing the threat of recidivism, but also pay attention to what was going on in the system itself. And so, some of it had to do with simple budgetary matters, to restore things that needed to be happening, even though it's unattractive. Avoid the trap, though, of trying to build yourself out of the overcrowding that exists, and ultimately recognize that reducing the level of the population in prison the right way is actually directly connected to reducing the level of crime. And so while there were multiple things that took place, it started with actually creating a reentry council at the governor's level. And that only came about because of the level of attention that the governor wanted to pay to it. And it meant within corrections, there was a deep need at starting to do things like risk assessments, starting to do discharge planning based on the social science that suggested what happens to somebody 8 to 12 weeks out is the most important piece of this. It had to do with changing the law so that the max out percentage was being reduced. But it also started to deal with the parole board, an institution that had largely been ignored, and yet a substantial portion of the people coming back were for technical parole violations. And I think at that time the state of New Jersey had the largest percentage of folks who were incarcerated for drug offenses. And all told, and I was going back and looking at the data and having some national work, New Jersey was one of the states that had the largest percentage of reduction in the overall levels of incarceration of any state in the country. And it's another example of how it was really in the lead of many of those trends that are now accelerating.
If I might interject, I was at a Rutgers basketball game or something sometime in the last 2 months, and a young lady came up to me and said, I'm in charge of, and I don't remember the acronym now, the educational program in the prisons.
Yeah.
And she gave me which we started, I think in Ken's work, and she cited that they now had graduated something, if my memory serves me correct, 350 people from college since we had been there. There were something like 50 lawyers, and there were 20 PhDs, and she was beside herself with joy on how she thought this was working, and that came out of the efforts that we were working on and when we looked at the prison system.
David Socolow can do the Mad Lib on this one.
Can you jump in?
Governor, that program that was started in your administration is New Jersey STEP.
Yep, exactly.
President Obama created the Second Chance Pell Initiative, which corrected in a pilot way the change to the Pell Grant program that prevented incarcerated individuals from getting Pell since 1994 in the crime law. And 2 of those sites are in New Jersey and are under the NJ STEP program. So it is built on.
That was exactly what the young lady was telling me.
I'm sure it was.
And actually, a lot of the reentry work that Ken just mentioned, you may remember the governor's, you had a strategy for safe streets and neighborhoods, and it was a 3-part strategy: law enforcement, prevention, and reentry. And there was a huge amount of work that happened in the Department of Labor that David led, in the DOC, with the AG's office, and it was really, I remember this, and I remembered it because I'm still in touch with the first woman to hold the job, but we hired full-time staff to coordinate statewide, and it was really, at the time, a very revolutionary thing to do, which all these years later, it seems like every state has now come to this point. But I remember having a conversation at one point, and it might have been with you, David, where we were talking about how the folks that would go to DOL didn't know what was that no one was knitting together all these pieces of the puzzle. So there was one person experiencing, and I think about this a lot now in criminal justice, but one person is experiencing multiple institutions, as though, everything is siloed and trying to work so hard to knit that together. Yeah. Do you want to add anything else on reentry, since we've got you had a hot mic?
Just on that point, one of the insights that we tried that I think is now a national trend was this whole idea of sort of really intensive job coaching, that is following people at the actual work site when you get them placed, once they've re-entered and they've gotten a job. It used to be that people would count a job placement as a terrific victory, and people who are getting a job in the civilian workforce for the first time after years of incarceration have reentry and transition issues. And the job coaching model that we followed is actually the model that is often used for individuals with disabilities when they get into the workforce. Really intensive, paying attention to those relationships, and it's worked really well.
It's great.
We had some of that too, Ann, at Dovey, because a lot of the insurance companies would not allow people who had been incarcerated to come back into the workforce in certain positions. They couldn't be truck drivers. They couldn't be in any kind of fiduciary position. Right. So we were working to get those restrictions lifted too.
That's right. That was also part, I think, of the strategy, was looking at, and we looked at a lot of the DOC programming as well, which was often, you remember when we first looked at it, people were being licensed for jobs that they couldn't actually perform because of restrictions, which made no sense.
Or jobs that didn't exist, that essentially the training was based on what you could essentially looking for the keys under the streetlight because the light is better, not because that's where you lost the keys. And so they were training for what was convenient and easy to train people for within the confines of a prison, rather than what were the jobs that were likely to people get when they got out.
I mean, one of the things that's striking is just noting how many different cabinet agencies were involved. And that only comes because there's leadership. I remember at DOC, right, one of the key issues people have leaving prison is whether they have an identification card. Something that seems very simple, but unless DOC is really committed to taking that on as an issue, all the rest of the things that people would want to provide. But certainly, and I know this from your own experience, in so many places, that kind of coordination is something that's the easiest thing to fall through the cracks. It can only happen if you've got, the credibility of saying the governor wants this to happen, and that leads many people who would otherwise never come close to the issue to start engaging in it. Doesn't mean that we got all the way there in many respects, but I think we started it consistent with, Ron's observation that you plant seeds that bloom flower.
What was interesting when we started to look at it was after people got word that we were trying to fix it, I remember getting calls from employers saying, I'm hiring these people, I've hired these people, and I've hired them anyway because there's a shortage in my particular industry, and I really like if they could be insured.
Yeah.
So I really hope you can get this done.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I sat in, at the end of the Obama administration, I sat in a White House meeting about getting federal IDs for people, and I remember sitting there and thinking, how is it possible that all these years later, when we were talking about in 2008, that you were still talking about it on the federal level happening? And I think it's still in progress in the federal, doesn't exist yet. Yeah, I think it's part of the new legislation. It's one of the pieces, which is pretty extraordinary. And anything else on DOC?
I think that it was an ongoing thing. One of the challenges, just to mention, may have been covered in the first session, is who we were going to recruit as the first commissioner in the Department of Corrections. I just want to say that it was an introduction to the challenge of trying to find talent for positions such as that. It's a complicated system. Multiple parts of it were under consent decree. I remember spending more time than I ever would have imagined about healthcare in prisons and the contract coming up, which was a huge issue given how poor in multiple respects that is. So I think it was about the idea that some of these things are so structural, so embedded, that they can't be solved simply. And it leads to the kind of messy things that don't reach the public attention to pick up. And I think, with some good hires and I think the level of attention, there was real movement.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I'll add my reentry. I had the statute forbade the public advocate, the one thing, from initiating any litigation on corrections. That was before my time. But they did put the Office of the Corrections Ombudsman in my department, so he took me to, I think I've eventually visited a majority of the state correctional facilities. And to pick on what Ken was saying, some of the issues that prevent reentry would sound trivial to us. The ID card issue, dealing with jailers. The issue that I sort of got angry about for a while, but I will admit, in the end, I don't know if I could do anything about the phone system. Inmates were being charged like $50 for a phone call with their family. It could be Brooklyn or something like that. It was outrageous, the amount of money. When you would think that what you want to do is enable them to keep their structures and relationships and to be able to reintegrate quickly. And we made it so difficult through, I never was able to really dig down deep into how that contract happened. And I think I've heard it's sort of been fixed partially now, but I think it speaks to a comprehensive approach. And I hate to say, if we'd had another 4 years, I think all of us who had some part of that would have gotten together and come up with an even more comprehensive plan.
Yeah, and it remains a massive issue nationally. This is still debated every day. Ricardo, can you talk us through, I mentioned the safe streets and neighborhoods, and you and I did a lot of this sort of day to day. Can you maybe talk us through a little bit of, we made a very conscious shift, both internally in the AG's office and statewide, with how we thought about law enforcement and communities, and maybe you could talk us through that.
Sure. So, but they also get charged in the state for emails. I think it's like 25 cents an email, if you can believe that, to send an email. Today, yeah. So one of the things, and this is a real benefit that you have in New Jersey that you don't have in other states, is that your Attorney General oversees all 21 county prosecutors and all law enforcement departments throughout the state and all the police departments. And so the Attorney General has the authority to issue directives that they have to follow. And it's invaluable, and I think the administration made a concerted effort to use that to the best of our abilities. And in a time where you have every municipality is suffering from limited resources, and nobody wants to spend more money on the budget or have to raise taxes to spend money on things like law enforcement. There was an absolute need to make smart decisions on how you use law enforcement resources, how you deploy law enforcement. So I think it was two-pronged. One was on that to make sure that the money was being spent on things that actually got results, right? So it's great that somebody's going to buy a bunch of cameras, the eye in the skies in Camden, I remember. But if I remember the first rollout, I think your head exploded. They were going to put them all in like the one area near Cooper Hospital that least needed it. It made no sense from a crime perspective, right? To put it all around the area that's pretty well lit.
My head did explode.
Yeah.
I remember that.
And that's a kind of decision that if you weren't looking at it and the folks underneath you weren't looking at it, would have gone 5 years later, somebody would have said, wait, why do we have 10 police cameras out of 12 in this one vicinity? It makes no sense. And so there was a focus on looking at the data where the crimes were occurring, not just in Camden, but everywhere, but particularly in Camden, and said, all right, we have a limited amount of resources, let's figure out where we can maximize our use. And I think along with that was also a different way of looking at how all 21 counties, particularly in the violent cities, were dealing with gang violence and violent crime. And it's often too easy, and I didn't appreciate this before I got there, it was often too easy to focus on low-level criminal drug dealing, right? And so, yes, it's a crime, but you end up with high incarceration rates, high juvenile detention rates, all the other, and you don't get a return on that investment. So you expend a lot of law enforcement resources, judicial resources, and you end up putting some 18, 19-year-old in jail for a year for a low-level drug offense. And so the idea was to hold county prosecutors accountable, and I remember they may not have liked some of it, but all the police departments had to appoint somebody once a month. We started the gang stat, where in the 21 major cities where we had, or 20 I think it was, cities, they had to come together, all the local law enforcement folks, and the feds participate in this as well, and have a conversation about, all right, where's the drug activity, where is the real gang activity, the violent crime occurring, what are we doing to stop that? And it was sort of a great lesson in how to have more intelligent policing. Use the data you have, share the data, which is a whole other piece that we were able to accomplish, but really use that to focus on the most violent folks that will have a trickle-down effect on the other low-level drug activity.
And I think the statewide stats, I mean, I don't know if you remember this, I checked it last night, but between 2006 and the beginning of 2010, murders were down 13% statewide, and violent crime was down more than 8%. Nationally, crime decreased during that same period of time, but not like that. And I think it's really a tribute to sort of having both the structure of the state and really shifting the focus to violence and taking it off of narcotics.
And they needed somebody to hold them accountable. And it was from your office that you had folks going down and literally meeting with them at least once a month, and sometimes more frequently, once a week with certain cities.
Yeah, I think we went to every county prosecutor's office on that as well. I have sort of a recollection of going to Salem and them saying, you guys are the first folks we've met from the state AG's office. We were welcome.
Ann or Ricardo, I don't, my memory is foggy on this again, but what sticks out in my mind is we talked about, 200 yards of a school, and we changed that law, which probably did more for cutting away these low-level drug dealing crimes. And I can't remember what the metric was, but it was such that there were about 4 inches of square space in Newark that you weren't subject to the application of that law. And that was true in every community across the state. And you didn't have to be a genius to say that we either eliminate this or you get it to a point where it's like a block or something close to a school. So otherwise, the whole urban community was automatically subject to severe incarceration obligations from that.
So you may not remember the beginning of this story. It's like imprinted in my mind, which is we pulled all the data on the state incarceration for you, and we were trying to understand the depth of the disproportionate minority incarceration, which exists statewide here and in many other states. And this was cataclysmic. This was the thing that we could see that was just the outlier from everything else, which was that everyone arrested for drug sale in Camden, Newark, or Trenton was arrested under the school zone law, and the penalty was just, I can't remember.
It was like double or triple.
I think it was triple.
Would be if you were.
It was extraordinary, and it was mandatory. And so it was just an immediate sort of path to a very lengthy term of incarceration. Whereas if you were arrested in a rural county, in a suburban county, you were not prosecuted most often. You weren't always under the school zone. And so you said to me, get it done. You may remember, and this is an interesting thing that I think is worth saying, which is that we had a lot of bipartisan support for a lot of the reform work we did, and we both did intense progressive reforms and law enforcement reforms. And so, but I remember that there was some resistance in the Democratic leadership in the state legislature, and you may recall sending me to North Jersey for a series of meetings with members of the state legislature, and I remember them like it was yesterday. And basically just saying to folks like, look, this is unfair, here's the data, here's the conversation, and really negotiating a path to stop it from being mandatory, to give judges discretion and really essentially take out school zones. And my recollection is you signed it on your last day in office, or the day before it was like one of the last things that you were able to do, and it has had an incredible impact on the levels of incarceration and on disproportionate minority incarceration.
For purposes of those that will hear this over the fullness of time and are studying governors, it's actually this discussion tells you why state government is how it can be so impactful. Because with a little dose of data and a little common sense of examining, whether it's cameras on street corners or understanding how laws actually work and then lead to multiple ripples of injustice to broad sections of our society, they have to be broken up into small enough pieces that you can actually understand what the details are. It's nice to talk about them theoretically, but these things, all the stuff has a real practical reality.
And I should add this one thing, which is this is another example where not many people were our friends, right? If you recall, the prosecutors were not fans of this, particularly the prosecutors in the major cities. They liked having the ability to say, if you don't, to try to flip people to become cooperators. If you don't cooperate with us, you'll face 8 years versus 1. And the police officers were not so sure about it either. Again, everything's been fine, and it was all done through, conversations and negotiations. But it's a great example of sort of taking on an issue also where it wasn't like the stars were aligned when you started. They just got there at the end. So. We've talked about a number of things. I don't want to not touch a little bit. There are a couple of things I want to make sure we touch on, and I'm not sure who best to talk about this, but one of the ways in which I think from a really difficult circumstance, we got a little bit lucky, which is to say that the financial crisis led to the stimulus law, which led to about $33 million coming to the state of New Jersey for use for law enforcement. For basically, we had essentially full reign over where that money went, and it passed through the AG's office. And you may not remember this, but I called the Department of Justice because you said find evidence-based programs. And so I called the Department of Justice. I'd worked there. And someone said, well, we really like the Boys and Girls Club. And I was like, we really like them too, but we cannot give them $33 million. It seems excessive. Maybe not the right way to solve all problems in the state of New Jersey. See, in my old age, I'm just like talking the truth. But we had a lot of money, and we put a lot of money into prevention and expanded prevention programs for kids. Julie or Kevin may remember some of those. We put a lot of money into the reentry, and so it wasn't just the council, it was also putting money behind it. And then we put money into some of the law enforcement work, including things like gun tracing and other projects we did.
Well, I certainly can remember the speaking most to the law enforcement part of it, but I do remember it was sort of for people who don't appreciate it because they think of the Attorney General as law enforcement, sitting at those staff meetings, and it was literally spent 1/3 on law enforcement, 1/3 on reentry with Wanda or Shavar Jeffries talking about reentry and what they were doing there, and then 1/3 on prevention with Creighton talking about the stuff that we were doing on the prevention side. I think just on the law enforcement side, I think it was to the point of you need data in order to be able to justify why you're, in order to, one, put your resources smartly in the right places and also justify why you're doing it. So a lot of that was done with this money. Some of it was done to collect data. I remember was the gunshot cameras, right, where they would turn automatically to wherever there was a gunshot. And it was basically got to the point where in Camden, you could pretty quickly, within minutes, figure out where the crime was occurring and then redeploy officers there. And you needed that with the lack of manpower. And along with that, it was just the idea that the more data you give to police officers and to the folks who are deploying them, the better you're going to be at preventing crime, not just arresting folks, but actually preventing it by putting law enforcement there.
We also, one other thing I always think about was, Governor, you may remember this, the E-Trace program, which is that, and it's worth just talking about for a minute because it was, I think, one of the people from ATF still give me a hard time about it, which is that at the time, the way that gun tracing worked was that in the state of New Jersey and nationally, was that ATF would let a local police department query the origins of a gun, and they would send the information back to that local police department. So if you think about New Brunswick and Edison being right near each other, New Brunswick wouldn't know about guns recovered in Edison. Edison wouldn't know about New Brunswick. It makes no sense because obviously people who commit crimes cross county boundaries and town boundaries all the time. So what we realized is that New Jersey was an integrated state, and so the AG's office was integrated, the state police was integrated, and so we had the state police do the queries, and so they queried for all 560-something police departments in the state, and it went back to the state police, and then the state police shared the information statewide with all the police departments. And so for the first time, and we were the first state to do this, we were able to essentially trace guns statewide and be able to say, okay, this gun, it pinged in Newark, but it's also pinged in Trenton, and to provide that information to law enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, it was crazy that they weren't doing that, right? So like if the gun were used in if it was a possession crime in Passaic County town, you would not ever know if Essex County, if the gun had been used in an actual murder. So and there would be no way to trace that. And that's, again, goes to the benefit of having everybody coordinate on the Attorney General's office, so you could issue a directive requiring that be done. And I remember there was a lot of pushback from the ATF because I think it was a lot of, I don't really know, I really don't understand why, but they didn't want to have to go through the trouble of doing that.
Yeah.
And I think some of the counties and police departments didn't necessarily like that additional step, but it certainly was important to gather that information.
And it allowed the state police to build a really comprehensive gun repository of information statewide.
Yeah.
Do you remember that?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I would love to hear this group talk. You've hinted at it a few times, but the politics of all of this is amazingly difficult. It's difficult when you want to monetize turnpikes. It's difficult when you want to change school funding formulas. But dealing with criminal justice issues, whether it is arguing with Sharon, my wife, about the death penalty, or
By the way, I'm always with Sharon.
Me too.
I was going to say it on the record.
or
from New Jersey, and everybody's going to see this for.
Well, for the record, Team Sharon.
Team Sharon.
how about the politics inside it? Right. Anyway, trying to bring a reform agenda on issues where people have this emotional context to how they address it, and some reasonable and some not. Can we have a little bit of discussion?
Well, I'll kick off for whatever it was, the couple of years that I was there. I'm struck, Ann, when you were talking about the importance of evidence, I think that's true, but I think evidence only takes you so far. And one thing I was reflecting on is that I think there were mechanisms by which the proposals we were seeking, we were trying to get legitimacy, and we frequently use commissions of people from the outside as a way of bringing folks together. And obviously, if you're appointing them, you have some ability, but if you skew it too far, then it doesn't have any. And so in the death penalty, for example, you remember Reverend Howard chaired the Death Penalty Moratorium Commission, but we had prosecutors and spent more time trying to keep the prosecutors neutral, even though they actually reported to the Attorney General, but had people who had lost family members on it. And On something like the death penalty, at the end of the day, because the legislative leadership allowed people to vote their conscience, I think that was the key piece, because I don't know what would have happened had the traditional political play gone out. But, I'm struck also in the racial profiling piece. I think Jim Johnson had been appointed to do a set of hearings, and I think it's really hard in some of these instances. I think that it was viewed as being, very much a focus on an urban community and, really focusing on the racial equity elements of it that at times didn't play all that well. But at the same time, when you were able to combine the revenue consequences of some of it with the idea that it was the right thing to do, with the idea of engaging people, that was the best play that we could make. And I think, at least, for the parts that I was involved with around the death penalty, around the racial profiling piece, around some of the early legislative pieces, that was the way we did it. But nobody's pretending it was easy, and there were plenty of legislators who pushed back.
I would agree a huge amount on both the commissions and also on the listening. I mean, I remember just being in every church in Camden for the better part of a month and just going, and people were upset. We always dealt with complicated issues, and so I think, but we were open to hearing people, and I think that's really important. One of the other things I think you can't undersell, I think, two other pieces. One is that people really believe that your motives, Governor, were good, that you cared about the policy, you cared about the people, and it did go a long way. So in addition to having the data, I never walked in a room with a state legislator or anybody else that they thought there was some deal the governor was going to cut or some benefit to him. It was always a policy question and a substantive policy question, and I can't say how much I think that matters when, and look, I remember a member of the legislature walking into my office, and you may remember this, Ricardo, basically we wanted some bill to be passed, and we were having a conversation, and the member of the legislature saying, well, I have this business. And we basically said, that's the end of the conversation, right? Like, we don't have conversations like this. We deal in policy, not politics in that way. But I do think that people knew that your heart was pure and that you wanted to do the right thing, and I think that helped us a lot. I also think it's worth noting that we did build some unusual alliances. And so, there were Republicans who voted for our criminal justice reforms, for both, to make some laws, some of the intelligence gathering and the data-driven work better, to offer more witness protections, and to change laws around DOC or other, we really were able to sort of cross the aisle on a number of things that I think mattered. What do you think?
The most important example is the death penalty. Kip Bateman and Bob Martin were absolutely essential elements of allowing for that bill to get through the Senate. And we won by one vote, so 2 Republicans on the bill. And Kip Bateman actually was a very, very strong advocate. And
what made you decide to do it in the first place? What motivated you?
As anybody who's ever talked to me about politics knows, this was one of those issues. I wrote my first paper at 15 years old on why this was inhumane and cruel and unusual punishment and inconsistent with fundamentalist Christian values that I grew up in. And so it always was there. It was a platform, even in my Senate campaign. I made a deal out of it and got roasted regularly in debates and other places. But I also always looked at it as emblematic of the unequal application of justice, not just with regard to capital punishment, but with regard to the kinds of things that we've talked about in drugs or other issues. And so you had to take those on. These things actually ended up being the kinds of things we were talking about, school zones. We got more pushback from Democrats in many instances than we got from Republicans on conceptual framework, because people thought we were undermining their neighborhoods. And it's one of the things that I've heard us talk about. But how you build coalitions on these sort of criminal justice, ethical and moral issues that relate to the judicial system and the application of crime are really, really tricky ones for people who are studying how you govern. I see it popping up on the marijuana issue. Same coalitions breaking down across party lines.
So there's, I mean, I think just one observation is that partly the push allows unlikely people to step in. So victims of crime, for example, I think one of the hardest meetings I ever took on your behalf was with people who had lost family members and were supportive of the death penalty. But you have to be able to listen to people at the end of the day. And it turns out that I think once you listen, there were a surprising number of victims of crime who were actually supportive of the proposals as long as they felt listened and as long as they felt like you were not ignoring them. And so some of the proposals that came out of the Death Penalty Moratorium Commission had to do with victims of crime at the end of the day. And so I think that becomes sort of part of the building block if one's attentive to
How important was it? So I think I was the Attorney General designee on that commission, and I remember attending some meetings that we ultimately decided not to vote since we were responsible for the enforcement of the law. But I remember a really key moment of understanding that some of the surviving family members were deeply against the death penalty because there had not been an execution for many years. Right. And I remember being surprised by what a powerful catalyst that was for their opposition to the death penalty. How important was that in building? I just remember sitting in the meeting and thinking I'd never thought of it from that perspective.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, so, you know, certainly the victim community was not monolithic. There were people who were going to come out against it, but it was so significant that there were people who were going to support the abolition. I mean, just frankly, from a political perspective, if you didn't have people on both sides, it would be very, very difficult, I think, for some legislators to be able to stand up to that sort of moral sense. There were people that you just needed to listen to. And I think people legitimately felt like they were being taken through the ringer every single time that there was a potential, you know, delay of an execution or another appeal that was being done. And I have to say, I think it was where Reverend Howard's leadership was so key, because he placed it in a moral framework. And I mean, he's a remarkable man, and I think, frankly, without his type of call to bring people together and to have real listening on that commission, that you would not have come out of that commission with the kind of unanimity that was necessary to push it forward. But part of it was, in fact, that the victims, the people who had family members who had been killed, were willing to stand up. I mean, I'm sure you also remember the very last minute issue that we had. It was recognition that I think there were only 8 people on death row at that time. And so all of a sudden on the Friday before the Monday, we realized that we had to make a decision about the commutation of those 8 people. And it turned out, as a matter of legal principle, that had they been commuted, they would have gone back to the sentence that would have been the next most serious in effect, which would have allowed them theoretically to be paroled. And so we had to make a legal call, and I remember talking to you considerably over that weekend. Could you commute the sentence to life without parole at the end of the day? So I think those were all sensitivities that were part of the overall calculus.
So I think it's worth, and I don't know if either of you remember this, but I think it's worth just asking how you got and maybe it's that the answer is that it was a very different time, but it's pretty unheard of today in American politics to let people vote their conscience, to have parties not require people vote party lines. Like, did you have to manage that? Did you have to? I can't imagine this one was easy.
You know, I'm going to give credit to Ray Lesniak on this, because he had worked the Senate leadership on both sides for a very long time, and that would not have happened without his lobbying more than my lobbying. He deserves an enormous amount of credit for having done that. I think Kip Bateman also did an effective job of making that case for a number of years preceding this that led up to it. So to me, it is an example far too infrequent, but where those of us who are blessed to have a chance to take state leadership and national leadership really do need to do more reaching out across aisles and to make things happen. Important things only really get done on the toughest things unless you can have that happen and sustain them, as we've seen with the healthcare law now, and I suspect will be the case with regard to the Trump tax bill. It's not only getting them done, it's sustaining them over a period of time, and I think we're in good position on the death penalty because it was done in that format, and there was plenty of really, really strong moral support on both sides of the aisle.
The one thing I just remembered as you were talking about bipartisan work was also the expansion of drug courts, which was something that happened under your administration, and also a great deal of moves to increase the ability of treatment space and treatment beds for individuals who were criminal justice involved. And I know that one of the bills, I think, subsequently was passed after we left, but that a lot of the work actually started. And I remember getting a call not long after we had left and someone saying, "What do you think of this?" And my saying, "It's a great idea. It was Governor Corzine's, and here's the draft of the work that was done." But that, I think, also is something that sometimes we forget about, the bipartisan work. Please.
I wanted to, I think, just add to that. So the juvenile justice reform was not done through a legislative mechanism. You know, I'm not a lawyer, I only play one on TV. And so the fact is that in the juvenile justice reform, our work was really focused on getting adults to change their behavior. And if anybody has ever tried to do that, that's like really hard. And so I wanted to just sort of lift this up. It's not the big P political, but the small P political, about the importance of the leadership in that moment when we're trying to get people who are, in this case, putting lots of kids in detention and telling us constantly, the kids who are there, the kids who are deprived of their liberty are the kids who need to be there, right? When we're looking at this and saying, there's another way, right? And sort of helping them to sort of move from that place of, I'm absolutely right on this and you don't know what you're talking about, to, you know, maybe I can make a small change. Maybe I can do something a little bit differently. And I think the data in that case really helps, because everyone has an anecdotal story about some kid who did something, and that's what they're going to stick with, even though the rest of the kids don't look like that. So I just wanted to share, you know, that sort of small P political.
Lisa, was there another issue? And again, my memory has faded, but we had and I think we worked on this with Kevin. We were mixing youth with adults in proceeding trials on a regular basis, if I'm not mistaken, which we put an end to. Was that part of the juvenile justice initiative?
It was, they did a bunch of research. The state, there's a state steering committee that currently oversees this work. They did a bunch of research on the waiver law and who was where and how much prosecutors were using it, which there was giant variation. Some prosecutors never use it. Some prosecutors use it all the time. Some kids stayed in detention 2 years. Some kids were processed through, in 2 weeks. So they did that, and in the past 5 years, they finally changed the legislation. And so now all kids who are on the waiver track, they've changed the age, they've raised the age for that. They've changed the number of crimes that you could be charged as an adult for. And they've also, in that law, talked about the fact that kids need to, if you're going to be on that track, you need to be in the juvenile justice system. So they'll await their trial in detention, and if they are found guilty of a lesser included offense, they will spend their sentence at the Juvenile Justice Commission. So they've really changed, how they do that. But that was hard. That really was horrible. And I just wanted to say, for the record, Kevin did call this a miracle of government, but he was very skeptical.
It all comes out. Do you want to rebut that, or ready?
No. I was very annoying as the child advocate, and it's hard to now think back that there were 14, 15 kids being held in cells that were 14 by 10 with Post-it notes in Camden County saying, "Good job keeping your cell clean." Yep. Was licensed for, I think, 37 or 38 kids. There were 131 kids in there. It was really a perversity of humanity, and the reform is stunning, really stunning, and you deserve an enormous amount of credit for it.
I agree. Thank you. And so do you, Governor. That's right. I'll say this also. I remember looking at the dropout rates in Camden, because one of the things we spent a lot of time focusing on was why there were so many kids. Camden has one of the high schools as a dropout mill that just more than half the kids, I think just half the kids were graduating, and seeing that at 9th grade there was this huge drop-off in schools and this huge uptick in the juvenile justice population attributable to Camden, and a third of our kids were from Camden at the time we started, which is just, when you start to look at the data, it can't be right. And I do think that the data mattered a lot. I think criminal justice is a fascinating space where anecdote has driven for so long and people's instinct has driven so long that it's really hard to push it back without access to real data and information. One of the other things which I'm sort of having, my memory is coming back, David, so I still need you. If you remember anything else, you should feel free to jump in a second. I think we also required that all defendants be audio taped during interrogations. And it seems like something, if you watch TV now, any crime show, it happens everywhere. But it did not happen in most places at the time. It was very unusual to require everything to be put on video. And the reason I remember it now is walking into one of the police departments. They had asked me to come for something, and they were so annoyed at me. It might have actually been Justice Radner when he was AG, but I took the brunt of this one, which is fair. They had literally popped holes in the walls to put the cameras in. And they'd done it in such a way as to essentially destroy the rooms that they had put them in. But again, this is something that now has been embraced by law enforcement, and I think is really important when you think about wrongful confessions. Having everything be memorialized is critical.
I was just going to say, think about if you're trying to change adult behavior, if you're changing law enforcement adult behavior, 20 or 30 years of doing it one way is even that much harder.
And in many political units that we have as well, how fragmented. Even though the AG has oversight, you have so many multiple departments and jurisdictional issues. It's a lot different than in New York City, where you have a police commissioner who imposes on their 8.5 million people. We have, God knows how many.
8.5 million police chiefs. I would just like to say that safe streets and neighborhoods in itself, at its core, was a balancing act. Because you had law enforcement, prevention for kids, and reentry, trying to hold the hands of people getting out of jail, not letting them fail again. Going back, robbing me, going back to jail. And I think with law enforcement, as I know, it was a really tough nut. We're giving them new tools to do a better job. And I think that's why they finally started to come around. And there's one other political consequence, and that is this being the center on the American governor. What happened to safe streets and neighborhoods when the administration changed?
Yeah, I mean, is that a rhetorical question? I never know. But you're right. I mean, it's a good question to ask. And I think to Governor Corzine's point at the beginning that 4 years is really not enough time to change everything. And one of the, there are a number of stories I could tell about Camden, but I remember the biggest concern I had leaving was what would happen to Camden. And if you followed it, the next governor made huge cuts to the police department, and it took a long time. There was eventually a separate county department that was formed. But it was not without a lot of politics and struggle to get the city back on track. And so there are, we talk a lot about consequences to elections, but particularly with policy, I think it's an underappreciated thing of how long it takes to do good public policy, and that even the best formed coalitions can be tough to keep together when administrations change.
what was our biggest swing and a miss in criminal justice?
You know, I think there are a couple. I could give you probably one in a lot of different things. I think we did an extraordinary job in juvenile justice, but if I had it to do again, I would have tried to have closed every facility, right? Sort of in hindsight now, knowing what I've come to learn, I think, you know, we went incredibly far, but candidly should have gone farther. I think Atlantic City was a city that was desperately in need of additional work and time from both a law enforcement and just a community safety perspective, and that was high on our list of things to do, but we were always committed to finishing Camden first, to basically putting a chief back in Camden. We did not, you and I talked, I think, repeatedly about the fact that we did have 8.5 million police chiefs, actually only 566, but, you know, divided, the sort of localized nature of government in New Jersey was deeply problematic for law enforcement. You know,
565 now.
Right, 565, right? But I do think that that's a systemic change I would have liked to have seen us make. And God, there probably, you know, I wish there was more that we could have done on guns. You know, I think we started the conversation around behavioral health, but I think if you look at the criminal justice system and access to guns in America, there are significant things that need to happen. There's a really long list. This could be hours of things, I think. Like, anyone else, things that you wish we'd done or that we missed on?
I think the last one that you touched upon with the guns, right? I remember at the end we started to have a conversation about one of the things you find out through E-Trace is all the guns are bought in certain states outside, you know, Pennsylvania,
not New Jersey.
Virginia, everywhere else but New Jersey, right? And so the trafficking of guns into the state is a huge problem. And I remember we started to have that conversation, but there wasn't just enough time to get that done.
I mean, one thing, I actually don't know how far it got, but the idea of coming up with a realistic sentencing commission structure, it was always something that, you know, do-gooders were sort of trying to put in. I don't think we figured out the right way to orchestrate something in which the meaningful consequences of sentencing could be actually institutionalized in some form. And as a result, I don't think got as far as we might have in actually reducing some of the really draconian sentencing provision. I mean, the other thing I wonder about, and as I think back, at least during my tenure, was the ability of using the pardon or commutation power more widely. Having looked at sort of what the Obama administration done, I wasn't as aware of what that could do as a matter of sending a message as to who was in prison and humanizing it in a way that could have been a really effective complement. And I think that can be done actually as a way to shift the public narrative as opposed to always doing it through the legislative, challenges.
I would say race equity, reducing racial disparities, and including youth voice and community voice and people affected by the policies and the changes that we made were things that had we really been known better, maybe we're a little bit further along in our sophistication, we would have been able to have that been inclusive in the foundation of the structure that was put together to get this work done.
Now, just in the criminal justice area, I can't think of swings and misses. It's, as I said before, we're situations in which we only really had the time to start the debate and not the time to finish it, but and there's still open questions.
Along the same lines, Ann, maybe we can ask, what is it you note that was undone after you left office that really sticks in your memory?
I mean, I would offer Camden initially as the one that, and I spent a fair amount of time before the transition with people in Camden, asking them to sort of take over the safety of the city, knowing we wouldn't be there, which is something I'd never done, candidly. I'd spent a lot of time in Camden, but I'd never gone and said, look, we've now shown that it can be safe, this is up to you. You have the political power and the money to do what needs to happen. And ultimately, I think that those people were successful, largely in making Camden come back from what were terrible budget cuts. I will never forget, and I will not say too much because we're being recorded, but I was sitting on a New Jersey Transit train the summer of 2010, 2010 and getting a call about the budget cuts to the police department, and basically having someone pose this question to me of what would it be like to have a county police department, and sort of spending an hour, I missed my stop getting off the train, but spending an hour thinking through, well, here are the things I would think about, and here's why I would actually do it. Like, here's why I think that there may be no choice but to make an incredible change, which is not something I would have supported easily, but for those cuts. And I do think Camden has done extraordinary. Now we're looking at this, 13 years later, but it was a rocky road, done, I think, more for politics than for the substance of what was right for the people of Camden. So that's the one that, sort of hurt my heart for a while.
In all fairness, though, the merger of the local and county police has ended up working.
I was supportive of it.
Even the police director we picked, I think, is number 2 in the county now.
Yes, and I was very.
It has not worked.
No. It has worked. It has worked, and I was supportive of it.
That's what I was.
Yes. Right, that's what I thought.
But it was necessary because of the cuts that were being made. The governor, the distressed cities money that went to Newark and Camden were cut by the subsequent governor. And so that meant that the police officers who'd just been hired had to be fired, which meant that all the sort of new blood, the culture change officers were taken out. Right. And then you ended up with a lot of, you just didn't have what you needed to make the city safe, and you candidly didn't have enough officers. And so the creating of the county allowed them to hire from scratch to sort of recreate the institutions and to build it out the way they wanted. So it was 100% the right thing to do. And under the circumstances, I don't think there was another choice.
By the way, though, just to respond to what how this works, I will predict that by the time the current governor or the next governor is sitting here working on their archives, there will be a controversy develop in Camden County about local control of their own police department and how resources are allocated. That was always going to be the case. We hear it, and I'm probably would be unsympathetic if it were presented to me further down the road, but I guarantee that that will pop its head and be a serious issue, particularly if there's ever a pickup in the crime rate in Camden and the core city.
Well, I don't know if this is criminal justice, but since it was almost exactly 10 years ago that the immigration blue ribbon panel that I chaired that you appointed presented its report, and one of its controversial recommendations was driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. And I remember we presented it to you, and you were really quite candid with the commission members who were there that this is just not something politically that you were going to be able to press.
In 2009.
In 2009. And I think we understood that. I think we understood why we felt we had to make the recommendation, well knowing that that was not the time for it. And it's just another example. Now it's gotten through the state Senate. When they get themselves reelected in the fall, maybe it'll get through the Assembly, right. and there will be. So I've actually, when I presented that report to you, I got it to the governor, I was a little depressed because there was this big, huge piece of paper that I thought was going to gather dust in the Department of State Archives like so many other such reports. And it's amazing how many people have actually said, let's dust that off in the last, well, frankly, in about the last year, at least in New Jersey. And that a lot of the ideas still have a lot of vitality. So it's just a matter of patience.
Well, and again, that gets to winning elections has a lot to do with what you can get done and what you can't get done. And it's the trade-off is the hardest part of being governor, is you damn well know you're running into brick walls that are going to have repercussions electorally if you do the right thing. And I think we as an administration tried very hard, for the most part, sometimes foolishly so maybe from a political standpoint, to do what we thought was the right thing. And self-serving for me to say, but I don't think there were many times that we made as blatant, let's wait on this until after an election, as that particular issue, which I was very sympathetic with. We had already taken on sanctuary cities and embraced things that were undermining of political support in a number of places. Anyway, I think one of the blessings of being a governor with this team is that people gave me their best thoughts, their best ideas, and I don't think they were afraid they're going to get fired or yelled at. I don't know, maybe they can yell. But I don't think people were afraid to be able to speak their mind on their issues. And that I think is absolutely essential of any executive, is to be able to hear the proper presentation and argumentation surrounding issues if you're going to get to good decisions.
Governor, do you want to say anything, or do you want me to start and you'll not be shy?
I won't be shy. I do want to say one thing, because Heather was with me from the very start in the Senate, helped build the team, very fundamental to what I said in the very opening remarks here. I got into politics because of trying to make a difference in people's lives that were left behind. And the person who taught me more than anyone else about that and how you could address it was Heather.
Well, thank you, and that's a great segue because we have some other folks here who were integral. And for this panel, I understand you had a fabulous panel that we will try and match. But we have equally distinguished panelists.
This is like a cabinet meeting. They're in competition.
Actually, Heather hired me.
I hired Ann, yeah. So she's better at finding talent. For this panel, we thought we would focus on a variety of social issues in which Governor Corzine was a leading edge among states. And we've got three fabulous panelists, but everybody around the table contributed, and we want everybody to speak up because we know you all played key roles. And I wanted a little bit of an introduction so you know how awesome these people are, because I think some of you we haven't seen each other in years. So Kevin Ryan, I'll start at the end, is currently the CEO of Covenant House. And so he is making a difference around the world in the lives of youth and really vulnerable populations. So his reach is really global, so it's really amazing, Kevin, to see you. And Kevin had been New Jersey's child advocate, and then Governor Corzine chose him to be Commissioner of Human Services, and he helped create and helmed the first Department of Children and Families. So he's going to talk today, among other things, about the transformational work that was done on the child welfare system. So look forward to hearing from Kevin about that. Julie was a DC person who we pulled into our orbit. We stole her from Senator Kennedy. She was a Judiciary Committee staffer. She had written the first paid sick days bill for Senator Kennedy, and then we pulled her over to be legislative director, where, among many things, she still has the scars to show for it when we got the federal commitment to the ARC tunnel. But let's be open now, right? And that's right, and paid for. And she's now a senior fellow at the Century Foundation and a leading thinker, really across the country in work and family issues, and doing amazing work there on childcare and other issues. Janellen was actually also a DC person whom we met. She was a presidential management fellow at the Finance Committee, and we sort of knew you on the Hill, but you had deep New Jersey ties, being from Monmouth County and going to the Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. So we pulled you in to be the education policy advisor and eventually the director of policy, and you took the lead on the school funding formula, which we're going to talk about today, and our other early childhood issues. So we're going to explore that. And sorry, Julie, I should have mentioned that you took the lead on paid family leave. And we were one of the first states to do that. So we're going to explore all of these. And then I know Dr. Jacobs is not shy. I hope we can also get into the work we did on stabilizing our healthcare system and some of the work actually foreshadowing the Affordable Care Act. So the themes we want to explore today are the hard work that endures today, I think is really exciting. The progressive trends that we were at the head of. your willingness to tackle really intractable problems, and that ties back, of course, to the groundwork, the work you did that endures today. And then finally, I hope we'll get into some of the stories of your personal engagement and how unusual that was, and we all have stories there. So, Kevin, I want to start with you because as soon as the governor was sworn in, he faced a really difficult situation in our child welfare system. And can you talk about what we did in those first 6 months?
Yeah, sure. So when the governor was inaugurated, there was a consent decree that the previous governor had entered into and a federal judge had signed off on that had committed New Jersey to make comprehensive reform to its child welfare system. It had gone badly. The state was alleged to be in pervasive noncompliance. There was a federal takeover motion pending, a receivership motion pending. And just some of the highlights of what was broken, there were hundreds of thousands of phone calls coming into the hotline alleging that children were being badly abused in New Jersey. There were tens of thousands of investigations. New Jersey was very close to a historic high in the number of kids in foster care and had one of the country's worst maltreatment and care rates. So children coming into care were being abused and neglected in the foster care system in New Jersey, more so than in almost any other state in the country. In fact, I think it was 49th. So it was a very serious situation. And I remember in our first conversations, the governor was talking a lot about the methods that he used in business to identify solutions to problems that were persistent, and the problems in New Jersey were longstanding and they were persistent. I can remember a tour of the Toms River South DYFS office. Now remember, I'd been the child advocate in New Jersey, so I was rolling around telling everybody what to do, and now I had to do it. And there were these folks who, I can't remember there being more than a handful of people who were older than 25 in this office. Many of them had tears in their eyes describing caseloads of 60, 70, and 80 children per worker. And it turned out that that was normative in many parts of the state, in Ocean County, in Essex County, in Atlantic County, and in Camden County, the caseloads were horrific. And, imagine as a parent, you roll into a classroom and your kid is one of 80 desks in that classroom. And here we are asking these caseworkers to make some of the toughest decisions at all hours of the day and night in some of New Jersey's toughest communities and neighborhoods, and we were overwhelming them. But this was a problem that endured under Republican governors. In fact, the lawsuit was filed under Governor Whitman, but also under Democratic governors, and it had stretched on for a long period of time with deep underinvestment. So here we were trying to figure this out, and the governor talked about how at Goldman, when there was an area that had been underperforming, he pulled it out and focused targeted resources with a dashboard that was driven toward the measurements of success, and then held leadership accountable, which I was thrilled to hear. And so within really no time—
cut your bonus. Serious regret.
And within no time at all, we had that first iteration of a new unit of state government. It was very controversial. There was bipartisan ambivalence to opposition for reasons that made sense, right? The legislature had been making investments, tens of millions of dollars in new money year after year after year. The results were poor. And here we were asking them to triple their investment, to create a new unit of state government, more bureaucracy, and trust, this guy who, had a mixed track record with some of them. Having been the child advocate, I was antagonistic and didn't have a smooth way in to the legislature. I think that many of the governor's deputy chiefs of staff and Tom Shea spent a lot of time in those first 6 months giving me some cover. The truth of the matter is, though, is that first budget didn't get signed until there was a significant uptick in investment for the child welfare reform on a map that the governor was deeply involved in building, and that investment changed the trajectory of the child welfare system. It's true that structure's not talismanic, and you could have a big entity like the Department of Human Services or a more discrete one, and either could work. But at the time, the Department of Human Services had a $14 billion budget, 22,000 employees, 7 hospitals, the public welfare system. There wasn't oxygen for the child welfare system to get the kind of sustained attention and reform that it ultimately required. And within 2 years, while important work remained beyond. In 2 years, the state had set on dashboards that Julie and I built and that the governor and I talked about monthly, state records in the number of kids who were adopted, state records in the number of foster families who were available to take care of children, and went from 48th. Within 6 months, we were down from 49th to 48th in child safety to 3rd in child safety within 36 months. It was the beginning of a really stunning turnaround. And as the coalition that watched this began to see that change was really possible, good things could happen to kids, we began to do more and different things that I'm happy to talk about. But as I look around the country, I said this to you, Heather, in the prep for this, as I look around the country and look at governors who are struggling with child welfare systems that are underperforming and kids who are not faring very well in these systems, both Republican and Democratic governors, the difference in success is about the personal involvement and leadership of the governor. It simply cannot happen. And what Governor Corzine brought to this was a deep personal sense of accountability on his own part, but also for us to turn this system around. And that game changed. That game changed.
I mean, didn't he go with you to the court and
yes,
and
yep.
eat with the monitor, right? I mean,
yeah. No television cameras, no reporters, which was kind of a thing because this was back in the day when there were newspapers, and there were seven beat reporters who were covering the New Jersey child welfare system in full or in part. New York Times, Gannett, Philadelphia Inquirer, Star Ledger, and the governor with no press attention would come with me to talk with families and kids on adoption days, on days when children were being reunified with their families. We would call that home for the holidays. And early on, we went to the Camden DIFAS office, and I was still in child advocate mode. And I remember going into a cubicle and seeing that the names of kids were being tracked on Post-it notes. And I said, "Can you believe this? They're tracking children on Post-it notes." He's like, "Aren't you in charge now?" I was like, "Oh my God, you're right. Stop looking at that."
No, a theme of the last panel was the governor saying to his team, "Get it done." And I think this was an important one. I remember meeting with the monitor, and it was get it done on this is a priority and it has to get better, and on making this Department of Children and Families so that we could really focus on it and do better. And I remember going around the state to public hearings where there were very, very different opinions about whether this was the right thing to do, but just knowing that it was coming from, the governor's heart that we had to do this. And watching, Kevin lead it and make it happen and then really start to turn things around was just such an honor to be a part of that. So it was pretty important.
I remember him said it wasn't failure is impossible. Mm-hmm. Wasn't that sort of the mantra, yes. Right?
Yeah. I will say one thing that Kevin talked about, and it was easy given both the front office support, but the leadership that Kevin brought to it. When you have a problem, you have to isolate it if you want to correct it. Although, you gave the statistics on where it was within an organization structure, and it's kind of like a conglomerate in business. It's very hard to have people think in a straight line with regard to the kinds of issues that we had with our children's welfare situation. And I think breaking that up and letting you infuse it with your sense of responsibility from an emotional standpoint, and then the genius that both in policy the whole team brought to bear really, really made a huge difference in the lives of children. And I think that's continuing from what I've been able to poke around and see.
Can you speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. By the time your term ended and the next governor's term began, the momentum was so obvious, and the coalitions that have been developed, in some part groups that had not gotten along for a long time, seeing the possibility of change and reform, had metabolized so deeply in New Jersey that the path forward was, I wouldn't say inevitable, because obviously deep cuts in investment would have paralyzed the system, but maintaining those levels of investment has paved the way for what exists today, and Governor Murphy's appointed to lead the system today. An incredibly talented leader who grew up in our reform effort and then went out and did amazing work in other states before returning to lead the effort now. And they're very close to exiting the litigation. It's really breathtaking to think about that. And sometimes I can remember how bad the headlines were and how terrible the reality for children was back in the day. And I hear people talk about, I want to build a system like New Jersey's. And I'm like,
Tom, do you want to say anything about the politics and remember?
Well, I think, just for a little context of, I think you all described, there was clearly, objectively, and certainly in the governor's mind, a moral imperative to do something about the problem, but there also was a political imperative. And if you remember at the time that Governor Corzine was elected, there had been the interim period with Governor Cody, but there was still a bit of a hangover from the McGreevey resignation, and there was certainly a sense, I think, among the population or the electorate that things in Trenton weren't working as well as they could, and I think there were a lot of circumstances where you could see that was the case, whether it was what was happening we were talking about earlier with the state police or with the Children's Protective Services in the state. So there was this idea, which was in a lot of instances true, and also was politically to our advantage, to convince the electorate that things in Trenton weren't working with the folks who had been entrusted with the leadership of the state for a long time, many of whom had grown up in the political system in New Jersey. And so the argument on our part was that it was time to bring in somebody from outside of Trenton, somebody with a proven record of leadership in business, to bring some other skills to bear in Trenton. So, and those big problems, and the Children's Services was one of the most obvious, made it not just, as I said, a moral imperative to address it, but a political imperative for Jon Corzine as the new governor to come in and say, we're gonna clean up some of these messes that have been caused by a lot of the folks who've been here for a long time.
So let's talk about another one. Janellen, I was coming to you. That played out intensely over 6 months, and then, of course, the hard work of implementation. Janellen, can you talk about what we inherited in terms of the school funding formula and what the process?
Sure. Yeah, just along the same lines of what we've been talking about, is a big, huge, intractable problem, a system that was badly broken. And I can remember looking at the data in early years, always being so driven by the data, and seeing that at the point that we came in, over half of the school funding that was being distributed across the state was going to about a quarter of the kids. And we also knew that the demographics had shifted so much, so that while at one point the lowest income kids were concentrated in the Abbott districts, that was no longer the case. And we had seen that half of the low income kids existed and lived outside of the Abbott district. So we knew from the data that the system was badly broken. And I can remember, I think the governor also really knew from the stories he had heard from people from the towns and the cities and the schools that he had been in, as a senator and on the campaign. And I can remember him saying, if we don't fix this, there's going to be a revolution. We have to fix it. And I think that speaks to, it was both a policy problem, it was a political problem, it was a moral problem, and it's a very big endeavor to take. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah. It does ring true, Tom. Does that ring true with you, your memory of coming in and saying, it's intractable, we got to take it, but we got to take it on?
Yeah, I remember, and this was raised in the last panel, that there were folks who said, wait and do it in a second term. But I think there was such a a responsibility to really tackle it early. But it was not something that could be handled as quickly, as the child welfare reforms. It took about 2 years. We had the special session of the legislature. We had a couple different iterations of the formula.
How many of us sat around and looked at
My memory's a little hazy, but I feel like there was also some legal reason why we felt like we needed to do it sooner rather than later.
Yes, in the courts
potentially.
Yeah,
My memory's a little hazy.
In the first budget, we essentially did flat funding for the schools. Across both the districts and the Abbott districts and the non-Abbott districts. And we went to court, and the governor came himself, which got, talk about personal involvement. And we said to the court, please let us just take this first year, and we have to do flat funding. The budget situation is really terrible, and let us get the new school funding formula in place. So there was an urgency, in addition to the moral imperative.
And that's why him going was so important, right?
Exactly.
I mean, this is putting my
lawyer.
you guys remember? Yeah.
And then it took a little while to get the formula in place. So in the first couple of budgets, we had to sort of take steps toward the funding formula. And this is what Heather was getting at. I can remember the governor, and again, was so personally and deeply involved in this. And there were towns in particular that he used to really worry about. And he was going around thanking everybody, came up to the second floor, going around to everyone's desk and thanking them for the work on the budget. And he gets to my desk, and Heather's standing with me, and he's like, pull up the spreadsheets. I want to see how Lacey Township did. I want to see how Egg Harbor, and we had like the slowest computers in the world, and Heather and I are standing there, and I'm kind of pulling, and he's like rattling off town after town, and I was like, okay, it's gonna turn out okay. But I thought it was just, I remember that so well, because after that, I always walked around with spreadsheets, like in my head. That he was just, but these are clearly towns and people and families that he had heard from that were really hurting because they had not had any increases in school funding over the past 10 years. Their property taxes had gone up, and they knew that they weren't getting what they needed in terms of their schools. And so, ultimately, we were successful in getting it done. You want
to speak to the
Well, I think I don't think people can understand how much this team put into getting a funding formula that worked, both constitutionally and in the context of some basic standards of helping the kids that needed to be helped. And it even stands today. It needs to be updated. Exactly. It needs to be updated based on what the population does. But we put real variable definers on how you were going to allocate, food, number of kids on food support, and a whole series of things. And there were lots of places in New Jersey that benefited enormously. Exactly. And we didn't end up hurting the places that had great needs too.
Exactly. It was very controversial.
They didn't like me in some.
It was very, very controversial, and I think we took great pains to ensure that it would meet constitutional muster, that the formula was going to really include the right level of resources for low-income students, and that took work. And it really took, it was a very significant period of time that we worked on it. And again, I think, just to underscore some of the points, I can remember we talked about earlier about the politics, and the formula was passed in the lame duck session between 2007 and 2008. And the bill was introduced about a week before Christmas. And I remember on Christmas Eve, the governor called me, and he was out of state, but he said, like, where are we? Like, what has happened today? Anything moving? And I was like,
Santa Claus.
It's Christmas Eve. I had to say, well, it is Christmas Eve, so I don't think we're going to see much happening. But we did, and we came, and it was like a couple days later, we came back in. It was passed right in the week between Christmas and New Year's, and then we used it in the subsequent budget, which was a pretty quick turnaround. And then Anne and her team had to do an enormous undertaking to get ready for court.
So, Tom, you want to jump in on the politics?
I just was going to say, I don't want to get too far into hagiography here, but if you want me to balance it out with some criticisms later, I'm happy to do that. But I do think one of the things that is relevant to both the earlier conversation and the conversation we're having now is that one of the reasons often that some of these problems are so intractable is that there are problems that are created because there are natural divisions between people, us and them. So in the case of criminal justice, so we're talking about the arrests in the school zones, right? Or most specifically in the school, I'm going to call it school formula funding as an homage to Patty McGuire. School formula funding is clearly a question of suburban versus urban,
right,
and white versus black or brown. And the same could be said in the instances in the criminal justice system. And a lot of times those problems are intractable because people are afraid to try and bridge those divides. That is politically more expedient to not wade into those waters because they tend to be pretty tricky politically. And I think the one thing you can say about Jon Corzine is that he was never afraid to wade into those waters, one, and he was more interested in trying to figure out how do we bring these people together and what do we all have in common as a statewide community versus what's happening in an urban community versus what's happening in a suburban community. So I also think that speaks to something unique that he brought to the table when it came to tackling some of these intractable problems.
And can you speak to because in retrospect, it looks like it went all smoothly, but it was never a done deal, right?
No, definitely. I mean, I would say there's sort of two recollections I have. And of course, we represented the governor's office and the Department of Education. And I remember the first question I got from either you or the governor was, the first time we had to go to court was, should the governor go? I'm pretty sure I said, that's not a great idea. The governor doesn't need to show up. They'll do it anyway. But it was a testament to how strongly the governor felt that he showed up and the court went with us. And then when we were preparing for the argument, there are a couple points. One is, it was by no means assured that the court would be with us. They had knocked down many formulas that had been created before, and so we had tried to craft a formula that would pass constitutional.
I don't think they'd actually ever addressed that successfully.
Yeah, and so it was really like, it's easy in hindsight now to think, well, of course they got it right, but it was really, I think we were all concerned as to whether or not it would get done, and we did it the best we could in the way we thought would work, but there was no guarantee. And there were people on the other side who were great advocates for children, who truly believed in kids in urban communities, that were afraid of what would happen. And so there was a certain amount of the fear of the unknown that was just out there. And so the court did ultimately go with us. But I will say this, I will never forget sitting at my desk and the governor calling me and saying, who do you think should argue the case? And I was like, well, it's very clear, the head of our education section, she knows everything. The governor was like, no, I got another idea. I think you should do it. Right? And I argued the case, and I was thrilled to actually have done it, although there were moments in preparation where
I can remember a lot of studying.
It was a lot of studying. But I think it really is, the court was incredibly receptive to the governor and really believed in what you were trying to do. But it was by no means, we weren't sure.
It really wasn't, and it was so critical that in the two budgets when we used the school funding formula, we had to fund it as fully as we could in the midst of an economic downturn. It was very dicey. And the other piece that we added, and I meant to mention before, was the preschool expansion. We always felt was critical, both from a policy perspective, a moral perspective, and also because the court cared very deeply about that. And so school funding formula included a very significant expansion of preschool opportunities to a greater set of low-income districts, and then ultimately to all low-income districts, all low-income students across the state. And that law is still on the books and is being funded. It has been funded in the last couple of years.
Well, speak to that, Janellen, that it seems school funding is still in the news, but it's actually not the formula, it's the amount going in, right? I mean, where does it stand now?
Well, I mean, the School Funding Reform Act is still the law on the books, and after being successfully blessed by the court, there's never been a new formula. There have been a lot of troubles with fully funding it. But in the recent years when the discussion has kicked up again around school funding, it's not been about let's throw out the formula. It's been about how do we tweak the formula? There's been a discussion about we always tried to work out how you would potentially ramp down aid over time, the glide path we would call it. That's been in the news. That's been what's been the focus on in most recent years is for districts that are overfunded, how do we ramp that down slowly over time? And then this preschool piece. So the infrastructure remains and is really a very lasting, significant accomplishment. It's just there have been tweaks, and now the preschool piece is being funded more fully.
Before we move on, do you want to speak to?
Well, the only thing I say is you're hearing here, and when Julie starts talking, and both what Kevin and Janellen have said, this is why we were here. There was a mess that needed to be addressed with children at a very basic level. That's what government's supposed to do, is take on broad-based problems that other people can't help themselves with. Our solution or effort to bring efforts to the school funding distribution is essential for us to be able to take on pre-K.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, expanding kindergarten full day for the districts that didn't have the resources. These are all part of the same cloth, is the point. And I said this earlier, I'll repeat it. We're debating how you deal with inequality in our country. If you don't deal with these kinds of starter set issues, you're never going to have progress along a more open society and equal opportunity. And that's what these guys did. We had a great legal team to help us do it. And I'm very proud of that work because we were really ahead of a lot of other people in doing it, and the great competency and care that people brought to it.
Can I just add on that point? I think Anne started to get at this earlier. Not only were we ahead of the curve, but the opposition were these groups that had been fighting on behalf of the Abbott districts for a long period of time. They had extensive relationships across the state and within the legislature, and we had to work through a number of issues with them. And
many of them were natural allies, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that you worked with on so many other issues, right?
Exactly, and some of them were torn because they really liked the preschool piece. They wrestled with the Abbott piece. But it was really interesting to see in subsequent years under the next governor, and even now, there's been a lot written about how it's a model law, how it's been very much supported by those groups that opposed it. I think because they needed time to digest, they needed time to see the law play out and be implemented, and to fully recognize the potential.
I will say that there was another piece that was very close to this, but others could talk about it another time, but we had a school construction fund that was completely abused and misused, and we took that on at the same time to help many of the same folks.
Exactly.
And they actually got a good start. And that's one of the things I also have been emphasizing. When you lose elections, it has consequences, and the inability to carry those through in some instances, and the school construction was very real. The whole prioritization of funding the education formula is another one of those places where a November day changes history.
So, Julie, the governor just mentioned these broader efforts to address inequality, and you led and had great great colleagues working on these issues. Can you talk, I think in particular, about the paid family leave? Or you always corrected me, family leave insurance, right? You always got it wrong. Yeah, there was a better framing. Can you talk about that and other issues? Yeah,
absolutely. And as you called out, Commissioner Socolow was instrumental in that as well. And so please chime in as I miss things. But I mean, first, I just want to note, I think we've been talking about these themes throughout, but that some of the themes of this administration really were equality, fairness, justice, protecting the most vulnerable. Like, we thought about, we were there to do the right thing, and that's what that meant. And I think, we take that for granted because we know this governor and that's who we are as people, but I think it's important to say that out loud because that's what so much of this was and what we were all fighting for and working for together. On paid family and medical leave, New Jersey ended up being the second state to pass this. California had passed it in 2004. This is a law that allows new parents to be with their babies, for family members to be with seriously ill family members, and to get some wage replacement while they're doing it, so that they're not, fiscally ruined because they had a life event that they should be celebrating and being a part of. And so this was really important. It's something we started talking about in the Senate office, and got to the governor's office. There had been an effort going on in New Jersey for a while, led by AFL-CIO and Citizen Action and others. The Time to Care Coalition had been fighting for this for a long time, and it hadn't really seen the light of day yet in terms of priority from the governor's office. And so it became something that was a priority, was on our list, was something we were going to work for and work toward. And so in May of 2008, the governor signed the New Jersey paid family leave law, and talked about how this was, I have his quotes. He said, "I believe the daily reality of the lives of New Jersey families makes this historic law a necessity. I'm confident this self-funded family insurance program," I didn't write that one, "will improve family life."
I was dreaming of this last night.
"Fill a gap in our social contract with our citizens and attract workers to this state." And I think that's important too, because there was business opposition to this, right? Just a little. And the governor knew that it was the right thing to do, and that the business opposition was coming from the Chamber of Commerce and kind of paid lobbyists, and that if you talk to people who are part of a business, that they recognize, actually, like, we care about the people who work for us, and when they have a life event, we want to support them through it, and we want to be there for them. And I believe even at Goldman that this was something that had been important to him. And so, we, despite business opposition, we did pass it. We had to make a lot of compromises along the way. I'd say one of my lessons that came out of it was to start really bold, because you will end up negotiating. And I remember at times feeling like some of our friends were negotiating with themselves a little bit. And there does sometimes tend to be, the opposition says this, And I think it's important to recognize the opposition is always going to say that, whether it's 12 weeks, 24 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 weeks. And so I think we went pretty quickly from 12 to 6 because that's what California had, and might have been able to keep it even higher if we had decided it was okay that business was saying it was a problem, because we knew that it was, it could work. But I will say that since the law was signed, more than 200,000 families have been able to take advantage of it and really, be there for their family members at crucial times in their lives. And I think that's so important. And then the other thing is that
Now they're expanding it.
I was just going to say, and more recently, those things that we had hoped for back in the day, our starting point has become a reality, that Governor Murphy has built on your legacy of this and gone further, which is really exciting.
How many other states have enacted?
Right now, 6 states and Washington, D.C. have it. So we were the second to enact it. Washington State had passed a law, but they didn't enact it until more recently. So,
David, you want to jump in? Yeah.
Well, Julie, I think that was very well done. And I would just say, I think that lesson of the compromises, one of the crazy things with the language, we were constantly trying to meet these objections, bending over backward to say that this is a benefit law, not a leave law, that, if employers already were required, certain size employers, to give people unpaid leave, which President Clinton signed in the first law he signed in 1993. All we were doing was adding the insurance, the wage replacement money, so that people could afford to do it, which was clearly about equity, because people with some resources can take a few weeks to be at home and were job protected already, but people without those resources didn't have that ability. And that conversation was endlessly frustrating. Everybody wanted to call it paid family leave, which sort of fed right into the opposition. And so I take the blame for your statement, Governor, of calling it insurance or self-funded insurance plan or some stupid language. But that was all intentional to try to sort of assuage this extremely vociferous, sky is falling opposition that we were receiving from, as Julie just said, from people who, you now look at it, law's been in place for 11 years, it's now been doubled and expanded, and the sky has not fallen, and thousands of people have been able to be with their families at crucial times, whether happy or very sad, and have a little bit of protection of their income.
And this concept will be on the agenda of 2020.
That's right.
For sure. Federal level, which is extraordinary. I mean, not because of us alone, but its time has come. And once again, as I talked about, I think this team put me into a position where we were at the forefront of a lot of things. We'll talk about healthcare in a little bit too. And it is, we have a lot to be proud of because we were there.
Well, and I think the long arc of your involvement in these issues testifies to how meaningful and real it was. I mean, that we got to know Julie when she was working for Senator Kennedy on these issues, and you were in the Senate and active on these bills, right? So it makes sense. And I don't know whether earlier you talked about that the first bill he introduced in the Senate was the End Racial Profiling Act, right? So there really is a long arc that not just your time as governor, it does connect. Tom, you want to, anything we got wrong on this? Yeah?
No, because Julie began her remarks by talking sort of about the philosophy behind this. And I think particularly with this portfolio of issues and from, the time, I'm thinking back now to the summer of 2000, driving around New Jersey in a Ford Explorer. And there was, from then through the end, both in the Senate and in the governor's office, there was a Hubert Humphrey quote that the governor or senator used very frequently, which I think is almost sort of an animating principle for this portfolio of work across both the Senate and governorships for Governor Corzine, and that was the test of government is how it treats people in the dawn of life, the children, in the twilight of life, the elderly, and in the shadows of life, the sick, the needy, the disabled. And so I think that was the philosophy that he brought to all of these questions, both in the Senate and in the governor's office.
Hear, hear.
Well, we're picking on Julie here. There was, not everything had to be invented here. Julie wrote a memo to me. I don't know whether it was Julie or Heather or both of them together, which was typical, about the earned income tax credit. Fat, dumb, and happy New Jerseyans had, by their own admission, left, $350 million to $400 million worth of eligible money for earned income tax credits for the people who needed it most. And we were doing nothing to go out and promote the use of the earned income tax credit. And I can remember Julie and I going to, these little shops or stores that I can't even remember what group it was that was helping us get people to sign up, and we got almost 300, someplace between 250 to 300 million of the 400 million on 2 or 3 year basis that we were there. And so I only say this is not every idea has to be creative, but you have to be committed to making the things that should be working work. And this group of people on these kinds of issues did that. And I think that's true about the educational formula. The concept was right, but you had to get it into a format that actually would work to accomplish what you need. And I don't think anybody was willfully, well, maybe some of the foster participants were willingly abusing the system for financial gain. But in general, the people in the departments weren't. But we weren't executing. You had to execute, and to do that, you needed good people and you needed the isolation. My whole point about governing is not only about it being bold with new ideas, which I think we were pretty good at doing, but then you have to actually make the stuff work.
Ann made a reference in the last session to how different the media was at that point. And I wonder, was it helpful in getting accurate information out or not for these issues?
I mean, I don't think there'd be child welfare reform in New Jersey without the media. And there were times that my God, if I knew that I would one day say this out loud, I think I was being held at gunpoint at this session because it was painful at times. But the media plays an essential role in holding government accountable for vulnerable people, and children are politically disenfranchised, and abused and neglected children are so vulnerable. And the media was relentless and told a story that galvanized a wide swath of lawmakers around this idea that we needed to create something better, a better world for kids. And some of those conversations, we had some of those conversations, and I wonder if people, I guess folks know what a good problem solver you are, but I can remember one conversation in which we were talking about all the kids in New Jersey who were legally free. That's what we called children who'd been taken away from their parents and their rights were terminated. We had 3,000 of those young people in January of 2006, and we had a real shortage of foster families. So many of these kids were going to age out, and the statistics nationally on what happens to children when they age out of foster care are dismal. Many become homeless. This is the work that of course this is what we do, right? But some of those kids, experience suicidal ideation. Some of these young people get involved with the criminal justice system, disproportionately so. So you had come back from a National Governors Association meeting, and you were saying, some of the governors were talking about the fact that lesbian and gay couples aren't allowed to adopt in their states. And I was like, wow. And you said, why don't we go target those lesbian and gay families? And so we marketed our foster care program in states that had closed the door on LGBTQ families. And that's how we set a state record. People were like, oh, it's amazing work. No, we just looked to all these families across the country who wanted desperately to be a forever family to a young person and had their governors and state legislators say no to them. And we said, come to New Jersey. And they did, and they became permanent families for those kids who today flourish. And New Jersey still is at the very top of the states that have children adopted by LGBTQ families across the country. And the other strategy that occurred to us midway through the first year was you were asking me a little bit about why it's hard, to get older kids adopted, and we were talking a little bit about that, and you said, well, why don't you take your best recruiters who are working with babies and toddlers, and why don't you make them family finders for the older kids? So we took our 5 best adoptive family recruiters who'd been working with infants and toddlers, and we placed them in service of the 100 longest waiting kids. These were children who'd been in foster care for no less than 12 years, and some of them had been in foster care for 13 and 14 years. And within 2 years, 73% of those kids had permanency. We taught ourselves, that's not a bet that any of us had made going in, but we taught ourselves that if you have the opportunity for investment and you focus the resources, you can help young people achieve permanency. And that also is a program that's very strong in New Jersey today. And as Lisa and I were talking, the third real hallmark of that year was the Foster Care Scholars Program. There are thousands and thousands of children who go to college in New Jersey after living in foster care their whole lives, and the state of New Jersey pays for that and provides a safety net for those young people. And anybody who pays attention to the data on earnings, if you have a GED, a high school diploma, 2 years of college, 4 years of college, these kids are moving into economic power in a way that's just fundamentally different than if they age out with a GED or worse. And that happened in 2006 because of your leadership. So lots of interesting problem solving.
It's nice you guys are saying your leadership. It's our leadership.
Yeah, no, I know, but I'm probably going to hit you up for a donation to Covenant House.
Oh, shocking.
I don't remember as many specifics around the media, but the thing that I did think was really interesting was going from the Senate, where we were one of many, and really doing such amazing work there, but not really being able to break through to the media about it, to then suddenly not being able to turn around without press. And so just really coming to see
outside your office, they're everywhere, right? Yeah.
Just the power of the bully pulpit and how the things that you were willing to say and to take a stand for really mattered because everyone was paying attention and writing down or recording every word you said. And I think we use that for good.
Just this is anecdotal, but I'm often asked, which job did you like the best? And there ain't no question. It's not, it doesn't mean that the work in the Senate was not really, really important. We had to deal with 9/11. We had to deal with the Iraq War. We had lots of things that were deeply energizing. Darfur, I go through it, but the difference of being able to use that pulpit for the stuff you believe in is just utterly incredible. And, I don't know, guys start using 200,000 here, you got paid family leave or whatever the hell you call it. And those things make a huge difference. Huge difference. So government, you got to tell that, you got to preach that to the kids of Eagleton, because there is a incredible leverage within democracy, as messy as it is.
I do think if you have a governor who doesn't have the impulses that you have, and New Jersey has a track record of having governors who don't have the impulses that you have toward care for the vulnerable, the diminishment of the media over the last decade poses a real problem for public accountability. People don't know enough about government, and the way people interact now in social media just creates this abiding skepticism about whether government is designed to do good and can do good. It's very dangerous for democracy, and the trajectory is bad.
Well, the media that you do have is so ideological, both right and left, that people only hear the extreme arguments, and they tend to be generalized and not specific enough for people to frame a view about how you should allocate funds for education. Or it's very hard to get a precise argument when it's so muddled up with the yelling and screaming of ideology.
Tom, do you want to say anything about the press and how we used it? Yeah.
No, but I think Kevin made the point, but I think it's not just relative to these issues. It's relative to everything. And I think, particularly at that point in time, whether it was due occasionally to corruption, sometimes to mismanagement, sometimes to both, there was plenty for the New Jersey press corps at the time to cover. And, we know now that for them, it was not just a matter of doing their duty as sort of a public watchdog, which is, of course, part of their motivation. But, there were Pulitzers in those stories for reporters who covered New Jersey state government. And I think you're right, not having that makes the process weaker across the board, I think, for everybody.
David, do you have any comments?
Well, it's not, it's not, at the state level, it's not really the ideology that matters. Obviously, you're talking about the wars on cable television news. But in this state, it suffers because there's no, the print media is disappearing. The TV media is not very good. And so advocates lose a very important platform. And, I know the reporters who are covering children's services. They're not there. Well, one person is
right.
But in general, they kind of go after the easy stuff, even down the trench, some easy politics, rather than trying to get in the nitty-gritty of policy issues. There's a website now that tries to do that, but I don't think it has a wide circulation. I mean, I'm a reader, but I'm.
Do you read Spotlight?
I think that's what I do.
Not an ordinary man on the street. But it has suffered that you can't. It's harder to develop. It's harder to develop support for various programs if you can't alert them to what's not being done right. So it is much tougher these days.
I still think that the default dialogue, though, goes to the hardcore advocates, maybe I won't use extremists, but even at the local level, it is the people who are prepared to be organized, as opposed, and generally advocates and generally ideologues. And I think we were caught in the transition of that.
Yeah.
This is not the time to be talking about the monetization program, but we had crowds of Tea Party folks showing up and set the agenda and carry that agenda, and I think that was it was damn near the case on the school funding formula.
Yeah, and in some ways, going to David's point earlier, like we had these reporters who you had longstanding relationships with. They were brought in, they were briefed, they knew the details, and then they wrote great stories that were factually accurate. Imagine. And so that worked to our advantage. And the longer you talked to them, the better the story was, right? And now you have just a lot of misinformation on social media, and the crowds the folks that are very well organized use social media to their advantage to spread misinformation. So we fortunately didn't have to deal with that.
Well, I don't know about that.
No, but I mean, in terms of we didn't
Spain was
have.
around.
Yeah. No, I just mean social media. We didn't have social media.
Dr. Jacobs, can we make sure you get a microphone? You were Commissioner of Health.
I need another microphone.
You were Commissioner of Health for 2 years, and then I had the great fortune to follow you and build on your tremendous work, and you had been Commissioner of Health for Governor Cody. But these were the years before the Affordable Care Act, when the healthcare safety net was unraveling, right? And and the impetus was building that eventually created, for the 100 years of attempts at the federal level to do healthcare reform. But we were those really difficult years leading up to that when things were unraveling and incredible hospital distress. And I think a really innovative approach that we took there that I thought was an important story to tell.
Well, yeah, thanks, Heather. As you know, there was an awful lot of problems in the, the general hospital environment. And hospitals at the time, there wasn't this big coordination yet, this big collaboration of 5, 6, 7 hospitals together, which create market forces that are really unusual in the hospital industry of the past. And doctors in New Jersey at the time were also basically 1, 2, 3-person practices. You didn't have the large group practices that you have now, the Summit Medical Group, and that was it, basically. So I used to get calls from hospital CEOs regularly late in the week that would tell me, and particularly one particular CEO at Jersey City, I don't have enough money for payroll next week, and unless you can come up with something, we have to evacuate the hospital. So you can't tell me this on Friday. You can't tell me this on Friday, because first of all, you knew it 2 months ago. If you didn't know it 2 months ago, then you're really in the wrong business, because you should have been knowing what the financial projections were. And besides that, I don't have any money. I only have the ability to take charity care and move it up. I don't have any money that the legislature hasn't appropriated for me. So we would have these arguments, and hospitals were on the verge of having problems all the time. So one midweek, I get a call from the governor. The governor would either call me Fred, doctor, or commissioner, depending on what was happening. And this was a commissioner call. Commissioner, I may have spoken a little out of school, but I figured I'd tell you about it. And what did you say, Governor? Well, I was in Hoboken, I was living in Hoboken, St. Mary Hospital, now called Hoboken University Medical Center. And I kind of told them we would save the hospital. Really, so I'll be right over. So I go over to the office, and what exactly happened? He says, well, they gave me this big argument, and it's, it makes a lot of sense to me. Well, what's going on here? I said, well, what's going on here in New Jersey is that the reason hospitals fail or don't fail is largely because of the political energy, the juice that the representative from that district has in the legislature or with the front office. That's why hospitals make it or not. And it has less to do with whether the hospital is actually providing an efficient, care-driven, quality service. Less to do with it, nothing. And in this particular case, see, this is what's happening. You got directly to you. This is a hospital that is weak in so many ways, but
Commissioner,
they were delivering more babies.
Don't worry, Tom, I'm going to get you into this. So he said, well, what would you do about it? As if to say, well, what would you do about it, wise guy? I said, well, what I would do is I would get a group of the smartest people in New Jersey representing all of the various constituencies, put them together in a commission and rationalize healthcare delivery in the state of New Jersey. Rationalize it. And who would lead that commission? So you have to be really, really quick when they ask. I said, Uwe Reinhardt. Who's Uwe Reinhardt? That's when I knew I had him. Because I didn't actually know Uwe Reinhardt. I knew his name. And so I said, well, Uwe Reinhardt is the James Madison professor of political economy at Princeton. Knowing his title was very, very crucial. He said, well, do you know him? I said, well, no, I don't know him, but I was at a lecture he gave once. So he said, well, you know him better than I do. Call him. So I go into Tom Shea's office, which is, at the time, a great honor. I'd never been into Tom Shea's office before, and he wasn't there at the time, which is the only reason I got in. And I called Reinhardt up, got his number, and I said, Dr. Reinhardt, my name is Dr. Fred Jacobs. I'm the Commissioner of Health, and I'm calling on behalf of the governor. And if those of you who knew Uwe Reinhardt know that he was very deferential to authority like that. So as soon as I said commissioner and governor, he was on his best behavior. Yes, of course, what can I do for you? I said, well, we want you to chair, or more rather, the governor wants you to chair a commission to rationalize health care in the state of New Jersey. He says, really? I said, and who better? I mean, he says, well, I don't know, when would such a commission begin? I said, well, it would begin as soon as we can get the commissioners appointed, but soon. Little did I know, soon in government speak, it was, what was it, 8 months? I mean, it was a long. I said, soon. He said, well, I have next semester, I have 2 courses to give. I have a basic course and I have a seminar. And I said, wait a second. You're going to let these Princeton students stand in your way of immortality? This is ridiculous. He said, well, I have to speak to the chairman and I have to speak to the dean. I said, okay, you can speak to the chairman and the dean. He says, when do you have to know? I said, I have to know in 48 hours. So he says, okay, I'll get back to you. I go outside. Governor says, what did he say? I said, well, he said he has to speak to the chairman and the dean. So this would be a great time to call the president of the university. Now, this is where the story diverts a little bit. There's my version, which I like a lot better. And there's Heather's version, which is probably closer to the truth. But ignoring that for the moment, 2 days later, Reinhardt calls me back and says, you know, the chairman and the dean were very enthusiastic. I said, really? And I'm thinking, boy, the governor, what a great job he must have done on this. He said, so we have to have a meeting now about, budget and staff. I said, well, we don't have to have a meeting about that. There is no budget, and there is no staff. I'll find somebody to help you, and we'll find money in the department. Don't worry about that. Let's just set up a meeting for next week. So I go back and I say, to Governor, Reinhardt called me back, and he agreed to do it. That must have been a great conversation you had with, the university president. My side of the story. Well, I really never got to speak to her because she didn't call me back. And I said, you mean you let Reinhardt make this decision on his own? Oh, my God. So, but he did. And, according to Heather, actually, they did speak. I ignore that because it sounds much better my way. And so we founded the Reinhardt Commission. We got people appointed to it. We met every month for 8 months, and we came with a document. That was the rationalization of healthcare in New Jersey. It occupies a very honored place on many shelves around the state. But giving Heather credit, when you get 4 bills passed, that effectuated 4 key proposals of the commission report. And I think the general hospital environment is better because of it. Not that it's still out of the woods. I mean, there are huge issues in the healthcare delivery system here and around the country. As a matter of fact, I heard the other day Julian Castro, just happened to be listening, said, there's a difference between health insurance and health care, an argument we've been making for a very, very long time. You can have all kinds of health insurance, but if there's nobody to provide the care, it doesn't mean anything to you. And this is the case with Medicaid expansion without Medicaid providers and all of those issues which were prominent at the time that we were in office and persist to this day.
So I can only add to that wonderful telling that what was exciting was that whole process that you put in place allowed us to move from that crisis management, which Tom will remember well, that the CEO of the Hoboken Hospital would find him in Hoboken, right? And, and to make the plea. And we were able to move from that crisis management to strategic planning, and we were able to manage 9 hospitals closed. Mm-hmm. And I tell the other health commissioners, 9 hospitals closed while I was commissioner. How did you survive that? It was ugly. We still can't go to Plainfield, I think, probably, right?
I don't go to Plainfield.
But that it was necessary, right? And that we had too many hospitals, and there were lower quality hospitals that weren't serving people, and it was draining the entire system. And
by the way, is Hoboken still open?
Yes, it is. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. Thanks to you, Governor.
And so something that was really that we did that cauterized the wounds, I think, that before the Affordable Care Act could pass. But something else that we did that actually, I think, that presaged the Affordable Care Act was your real focus on enrollment. Do you remember focusing on, we right, in every department, why do we have kids who are eligible for family care but aren't enrolled?
Right.
And if Jen Velez were here, she would echo that it was a constant, why are we not? And that's something now that we're I don't know if any of you've seen, that just recently was reported that for the first time there was an increase in uninsured kids across the country, and that we've started to, unfortunately, to lose ground, but your real focus on you wanting to constantly know how are we going to get, and that was paired with your obsession with maximizing federal revenue too. I think that was a constant theme was where's their federal revenue? How do we bring in more? It didn't always, Tom, to be fair, it didn't always work. You remember the first budget and what you proposed? The bed tax, right?
Well, we didn't want to call it the bed tax. I mean,
We gave it a tax, right?
yes, that's right.
Fred and David didn't like our names.
But there was an issue with that, that's right. And a lot of it was because people weren't telling us the truth. You know, we had situations where we would honestly develop, a conversation about maximizing federal revenue, depending on maintained beds as opposed to licensed beds, which was the big distinction.
Yeah.
And yet the Hospital Association wasn't always being as square with us as they might have been, because there were hospitals that were going to lose under that formula. And so it wasn't all winners. It was kind of a zero-sum game. And those hospitals that would lose because they were not financially sustainable anyway. Nevertheless, it took going through the whole exercise of the Reinhardt work to at least have before us a rational basis for actually engaging in this. Whether you could actually get it done or not subsequently, as the governor said, elections have consequences. And that was one of the consequences of that.
We did, though, I think, and some of this spun out of Reinhardt, but Steve, we did a bunch of stuff on insurance that expanded coverage as well.
I think my recollection is there were 40-something thousand kids that we were able to get insured under the New Jersey equivalent of the CHIPS program.
Yeah, family care,
the family care program. That was a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And we also...
This is a CHIPS lady.
Yeah, I know.
In the Senate.
Another thing that goes back to the Senate, right?
Yeah.
And then when, Tom will remember this, when CHIP was up for reauthorization when you were governor.
CHIP, by the way, is Children's Health
Insurance Program, yeah. When you were governor, the program was up for reauthorization, and there was a big debate about whether to harm states that had higher eligibility levels. And you remember, you mixed it up with the National Governors Association fighting for CHIP and saying it costs more to be poor here in New Jersey. We need more generous programs.
We had also done a lot of stuff that was sort of a precursor to Obamacare. We allowed students to remain on their parents' policies, I think in New Jersey till age 30, wasn't it?
Yep.
Till age 30, and we also, I think the legislation that provided that 85% of premiums had to be used for care or else...
Minimum loss ratio,
minimum
right.
loss ratios, or else they were going to be refunded back to the
That's a big deal. People don't, I mean,
It is.
It sounds not so much, but it's really actually quite...
Yeah, that was a big deal because the big issue was the CEOs of these insurance companies are paying themselves these huge salaries, and people aren't, they're denying claims that people are legitimately entitled to be paid. And so we passed that, which also was, I think, at a lesser number, but part of Obamacare too. And there were a couple other things that I don't remember specifically.
Well, we had guaranteed issue and the rating bands.
Yeah, we had guaranteed issue, which was a huge deal.
Another big
And then do you remember you signed into law one of the first states to mandate coverage of autism treatment? And that ended up being, Senator Menendez actually got that put into the Affordable Care Act based on the New Jersey
We also
law.
had something on mental health, if I recall.
Mental health parity.
Yeah, mental health parity, which was a huge deal. I used to get calls all the time from people who were, their families were absolutely being ripped apart because they ran out of the ability to pay.
Yeah, they were lifetime
for that kind of care, and there were those caps. And it was terrible, really. And so I think we addressed that too. We did a lot.
I still remember when the reports came out that New Jersey had the highest rate of autism. You saying, get me the expert from Rutgers who can explain this to me, right? And I wondered how that probably would not have happened under a lot of other governors, right? I want to understand. I don't want a memo explaining it to me. I want that person here tomorrow to explain why. And you didn't love the explanation too. What can we do about it?
Well, it was more rational than listening to Mrs. Imus tell us all functional vaccines.
So what have we missed to the rest around the table? We thought a lot, as you can tell, about some of the key initiatives, but
You
Can
know, UFD&J, which I...
Yeah, please, yeah.
Virtually everybody around this table
Worked on that, right.
But, I mean, I'll just start it off, and others should come in, including Tom. But, you know, the idea that the U.S. Attorney at the time uncovered very, corrupt activity from a really important institution. And I guess what strikes me in the year and a half I spent with the U.S. Attorney and his folks, receiving subpoenas and other such niceties along the way, was the amount of time and, frankly, political capital you spent in terms of recruiting people to that board, starting with Bob Del Tufo and moving on, that really had no political upside. I mean, it was the type of thing that was going to take a very long time to change. It's a critically important institution. It was an institution that by investing in it, frankly, at some point you were going to become associated with, including the bad things that had occurred. And yet the goal, like many of these things, was a very troubled agency, but it needed to be turned around, and especially given who the U.S. Attorney was and the strange practice where somehow things ended up in the press before they came to our office to read what the reports were. Just a strange coincidence. It seemed to happen on a regular basis. But it was a real, I think, testament, again, to engaging in a really serious problem.
Well, I also think that the work that you and others did laid the framework for the ultimate combination or merger, which we knew was ultimately the right decision. It was how do you get from point A to point B without...
You had to stabilize the anchor institution before you could take that next step, right? Yeah.
But it was only the credibility of who, Harold Shapiro, others that were attracted to the board, and they would only do it. I mean, they were going to be tainted as well unless they felt that somebody had their back in this way. So I think...
I'll make one observation, which I think, the prior discussion about the legal side of the administration and this as well, but I think it's true throughout. There was a lot of collaboration. I don't know how other administrations worked, but I always felt that every department felt a need to sort of keep informed with other departments that had related issues. I know Fred and I reached a point where we began to have regular meetings with hospital administrators, insurance executives, doctor groups, just to sort of make sure that issues that were in his bailiwick I'd know about and vice versa. And I think that was true throughout the administration. I think actually that was something, Governor, that really came from you, the idea of solving the problem in a collaborative way as opposed to just trying to deal with your narrow silo of issues.
That is one of the criticisms that's leveled at government that is legitimate, is that people don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And when you have bureaucracies that defend their own turf versus what's the greater good, and that only, by the way, it's important the governor recognize it, but the cabinet level operators and managers are the people that have to make that work. Doesn't happen with the governor going on a soap opera.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think the governor has to kind of create the environment where that can flourish, because if the governor or the executive is one who's encouraging these turf battles and these fighting all the time, it's very hard to collaborate.
I think that's right. I'm looking around the cabinet, we all felt included in the initiatives, and that then people are willing to bring something to the table in a way.
Fred felt really close to the Hoboken district.
Hoboken's my favorite place.
And he hasn't even told the
square
story
mile
about the
of
time
gold.
you lent the helicopter to take him to Cape May and then left him there.
He told that one.
Right, last time, and then left him at Cape May.
I've told that story.
That's on the previous.
Yeah.
70 or 80 times. Yeah, no, back to the UMD&J board, I was on that board ex officio as commissioner during this time. And Bob Del Tufo was the board chair, a terrific board chair, asked me to lead a kind of a select committee on the cardiology program, which was the issue that raised this stuff. There were practicing cardiologists in the community who were given salaries and academic appointments with the express understanding that they would admit patients to the hospital for the cardiac surgical program, which had a very small number of cases, so small that it was always at risk of being closed. So in the process of that, what we wanted to do, the committee, was to speak to the chief of cardiology, who had a fighting chance of knowing something about this, and the chairman of medicine, and we got word from the U.S. Attorney's Office that they were persons of interest and we were prohibited from talking to them at all. So we were blocked from doing a meaningful investigation at the board level because the federal monitor and the U.S. Attorney's Office had that in control and weren't letting it go.
One thing that we didn't talk about when we were focusing on education, because I think we got the prime things, but we also had big debates, Janellen, about charter schools, curriculum, standards. You want to inform us a little bit and remind me what I said?
Yeah, and it's a shame Lucille couldn't be here. I know she wanted to be here because she was also deeply involved in all of that. There had been work that had started under prior governors around high school redesign to try to make high schools and the assessments at the high school level more in tune in terms of really measuring the skills that kids would need for college. So you'll remember there was an effort to try to create, instead of just like a generic test at the end of the 11th grade, subject-based tests. And we furthered that effort. And at the end of your administration, there was all the work on the race to the top, which had started at the beginning of the Obama administration. Sort of some key components, because of course we always wanted to make sure we were going after federal money. Some key components were that you had to make sure you were adhering to very high standards as it relates to K through 12 education. And we already had pretty high standards, but we went through the exercise of trying to look and see where could we raise the bar, how could we make it even better, how could we become better in terms of the work we need to do for kids and families, but also to be competitive for the race to the top. And I think, we ultimately were not successful with the race to the top, but the standards, the work that we did on standards, again, was a precursor to later work that was done. Even when all the states started moving towards the Common Core later, we had already done the work so there wasn't a big leap to be made by the time further standards had to be raised in subsequent administrations. And with respect to charter schools, I think there's a lot of question about that. There was a pretty strong expansion in the number of kids in charter schools during your term. And so that was the kind of the path that we chose, was to look at the quality of the schools, not necessarily authorizing additional schools, but authorizing additional campuses. I think I have to pull the numbers, but there's a significant expansion of students. I want to say it was like a 20% increase in the number of students who are actually being served in charter schools. And because this was also some of the work that was part of the prevention plan that was in I talked about collaboration, but there was this recognition that you had to attack issues in the prevention plan from multiple angles as well, and charters were a component of that. So we tackled a lot of issues. I mean, we started the path of raising the standards, the charter school expansion, and of course all the work we talked about with school construction, school funding formula, and preschool.
And county.
Yes, when you were asking before about swing and a miss, I mean, I was reflecting on that because remember we did all that work to think about consolidation of school districts.
Absolutely.
And we thought we were going to start with low-hanging fruit, getting rid of the non-operating school districts, which were districts that didn't even have schools in them. That seemed doable, but we made effort. We made inroads, but elections have consequences.
What's the town on Jersey Shore that Sharon and I drove through on campaign day, and there wasn't a house?
Lock Arbor. Yes.
They didn't have a school system, and we were going to
we tried to say that they should be paid. It was actually a funding issue that they weren't paying their fair share. And when we put the school funding formula in, these are homes that are literally on the ocean front and $1 million at a minimum, and every single house had signs that said,
Corzine goes.
Right. Exactly. I mean, but that was a bit, because again, the school funding formula was trying to create and look at the wealth of every single community and base school funding decisions in a rational way on whose ability to pay was, could really be taken into account. So, but we had a lot of issues with that and with the consolidation of school districts. And so when I think about sort of things we didn't get to tackle, we had those plans in place to have every county superintendent come up with consolidation of school districts such that it would be from K through 12, so that every district, we have these crazy districts with, a couple of grades in each district, and so many different variations. And I think that would have been exciting to see. I think it would be interesting to see how that would have played out. And again, to the point about implementation, right? Like really, really digging into the implementation of that, I think could have been very rewarding.
I think that Janellen is talking about what I consider one of our biggest swings and misses is this consolidation of government in general. And if there is a single great untapped need, and there are a number in this state, the inability to have some rationalization of governmental units is got to be right at the top, and it leads to breakdowns and everything, and makes everything 10 times more expensive than it has. I don't know about 10, but.
Do you think we can get Uwe Reinhardt?
Well, the creation of the new Department of Children and Families was percolating in this way, right? It's going to cost more money, it's more bureaucracy, and you said to us, look, you have got to do this as efficiently as possible, and you and Tom and Patty are doing a head count and don't quite yet have the votes that you need. I think we're 13 hearings in on this. I don't really know what else there is to say. Pretty please, Chairman. And so I said to the team, look, let's just invite the members of the committee into the office and they'll see how we're going to do this. And my team was really psyched. They said, look, we got you all free furniture. And I said, that's great. So they laid the office out. It was all free furniture. I'm now rolling into the space 20 minutes before 3 senators are showing up for a conversation around how efficiently we can break up the department. And as I roll in, I said, where'd you get the furniture from? And they said, well, it turns out that the former Rutgers president and a former governor had their bedroom and living room furniture available for you. And I walk in, and when I tell you that the Palace of Versailles had nothing on my office, I was like, we can't do this. So I tacked the meeting over to a cubicle and said, I'm going to work out of here, which I hadn't been planning on doing. And they said, great, thank you for that. That's so humble of you, Commissioner. Thank you for that. And then one of them gave a speech on the floor saying he was supportive and we were doing this very efficiently and there were not going to be new business cards or new signage and that the commissioner was working out of a cubicle. So in good faith, I had to work out of a cubicle for 6 months. It's funny now.
So what other swings and misses do you all feel?
Well, I mean, I think a lot about what all we could have done working with President Obama, with having, I mean, in my world, implementing the Affordable Care Act, but so many things that having a strong friend in Washington, what difference that would have made.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think there's much more we could have done as it relates to, furthering being competitive in terms of race to the top and some of the other reforms that President Obama put into place. I mentioned earlier, I think for me, it's the biggest one is the inability to do more with school consolidation.
Right.
To me, what that makes me think about is, just the need to have funding to do the important work. And I remember there was a period of time in budget mode where the policy team was told, you've got a certain amount of money to spend, and I don't remember how much it was, but it can only be one-time spending because that was kind of the nature of the budget. And we were, this is a weird thing to say, but like kids in a candy store, but for good, we were, we found rape crisis centers that needed furniture and
we did special ed grants for best practices.
That's right. And food pantries that we stocked, more than had ever been stocked before. And so just to think about how we could have prioritized things like that had we had more funding to do that over time.
One of the discussions I think we are going to have is how do you handle a state when you go through a recession and see the kind of fall off, which is actually heartbreaking. And actually, if Obama hadn't passed the stimulus bill, we would have been, we were already up the river without a paddle, and we would have been a lot.
Gosh, do you remember all the work on getting shovel-ready projects?
Yes, and scrubbing every piece of that stimulus bill. Where is the money? Like, where can we?
I don't know if you remember, but in the cabinet retreat in January or February 2006, you gathered us together, and you were just ominously forecasting what was coming, and you said, if these three indicators turn south on us, and obviously one of them was unemployment, the recession, consumer confidence, I think some of the insurance funds, we're done. And so let's get going here. And that fueled a lot of very early proactivity on all of these fronts. The politics were a piece of it, but it was always like, we're on the clock, let's get moving. And had we been just a little more casual about the pacing of these things, much of this would not have happened, because it took that first year of kinetic activity to seed all of these reforms. I think that's true in all the areas that we've talked about today. It's one of the very important lessons for governors is when you get in, go.
I agree with that.
I know, you're the one who said it.
John, that may be a great point.
That's a great way. Yeah. Do you want to say anything in closing? It was a great discussion.
I just want to go back to the fundamental principle that teams win, not individuals. And when you have people like the folks that have talked around this table today, you have a real chance to make a big difference in people's lives. And I watch what you all are doing with your lives now, and it gives me great pride. Most of you are working on the same sorts of things in a different venue. It's a real honor to have been part of this team. And we did a lot of great work, and I'd like to hope we can use all of your brains in some of the next iterations in federal level and other things, because there's a ton of work to do. So anyway, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.